3. Tuesday, January 14. At 7 Thursday, Tuesday morning, in response to a telephone call from Brendan Cronin very late the previous night, Father Stefan Wyckowiak prepared to set out on a drive to Evanston, to the last known address of Calvin Sharkle, the trucker who had been at the Tranquility Motel that summer, but whose telephone was now disconnected. In light of the enormity of last night's developments in Nevada, everyone was agreed that every possible effort must be made to contact the other victims who had thus far been unreachable. Standing in the warm rectory kitchen, Stefan buttoned his topcoat and put on his fedora. Father Michael Girano, who was just sitting down to oatmeal and toast after celebrating sunrise mass, said, "Perhaps I should know more about this whole situation, about what on earth's wrong with Brendan, in case something happens to you." "Nothing's going to happen to me," Father Wyckowiak said firmly. "God hasn't let me spend 5 decades learning how the world works, just to have me killed now that I'm able to do my best work for the church." Michael shook his head. "You're always so certain in my faith." "Of course I am. Rely on God and He will never fail you, Michael." "Actually," Michael said, smiling, "I was going to say, you're always so bullheaded." "Such impudence from a curate," Stefan said, winding a thick white scarf around his neck. "Attend thee, Father. What is wanted of a curate is humility, self-effacement, the strong back of a mule, the stamina of a plow horse, and an unfailingly adoring attitude toward his rector." Michael grinned. "Oh, yes, I suppose if the rector is a pious old geezer grown vain from the praise of his parishioners." The telephone rang. "If it's for me, I'm gone," Stefan said. Stefan pulled on a pair of gloves, but was not quite able to make it to the back door before Michael held the receiver toward him. "It's Winton Tolk," Michael said, "the cop whose life Brendan saved. He sounds almost hysterical, and he wants to talk to Brendan." Stefan took the phone and identified himself. The policeman's voice was haunted and full of urgency. "Father, I've got to talk to Brendan Cronin right away. It can't wait." "I'm afraid he's away," Stefan said, "out at the other end of the country. What's the matter? Can I be of assistance?" "Cronin," Tolk said shakily, Something's happened and I don't understand. It's strange. Jesus, it's the strangest, craziest thing. But I knew right away it was somehow related to Brendan." "I'm sure I can help. Where are you, Winton?" "On duty, end of the shift, graveyard shift, uptown. There's been a knifing, a shooting, horrible. And then, listen, I want Cronin to come up here. He's got to explain this. He's got to, right away." Father Wyckowiak elicited an address from Tolk, left the rectory at a run, and drove too fast. Less than half an hour later, he arrived in a block of identical, shabby, 6-story brick tenements in the Uptown district. He was unable to park in front of the address he had been given, and settled for a spot near the corner, for the prime space was occupied by police vehicles, marked and unmarked cars, an SID wagon whose radios filled the cold air with a metallic chorus of dispatchers' codes and jargon. 2 officers were watching over the vehicles to prevent vandalism. In answer to Stefan's question, they told him the action was on the 3rd floor in 3B, the Mendoza's apartment. The glass in the front door was cracked across one corner, and the temporary repair with electrician's tape looked as if it had become a permanent solution. The door opened on a grim foyer. Some floor tiles were missing and others were hidden by grime. The paint was peeling. As he climbed the stairs, Stefan encountered 2 beautiful children playing dead doll with a battered Raggedy Ann and an old shoebox. When he walked through the open door and into the Mendoza's 3rd floor apartment, Father Wyckowiak saw a beige sofa, liberally stained with still wet blood, so much that in some places the cushions were almost black. Hundreds of drops had sprayed across the pale yellow wall behind the sofa, a pattern that evidently had resulted when someone in front of the wall had been hit by large caliber slugs that passed through him. 4 bullet holes marred the plaster. Blood was spattered over a lampshade, coffee table, bookshelf, and part of the carpet. The gore was even more disgusting than it might ordinarily have been because the apartment was otherwise extremely well kept, which made the areas of bloody chaos more shocking by comparison. The Mendozas could afford to live only in a slum tenement, but like some other poor people, they refused to surrender to or become part of the uptown squalor. The filth of the streets, the grime of public hallways and staircases, stopped at their door, as if their apartment was a fortress against dirt, a shrine to cleanliness and order. Everything gleamed. Removing his fedora, Stefan took only 2 steps into the living room, which flowed without interruption into a small dining area, which itself was separated from a half-size kitchen by a serving counter. The place was crowded with detectives, uniformed officers, lab technicians, maybe a dozen men altogether. Most of them were not acting like cops. Their demeanor puzzled Stefan. Apparently the lab men had completed their work and the others had nothing to do, yet no one was leaving. They were standing in groups of 2 or 3, talking in the subdued manner of people at a funeral parlor or in church. Only one detective was working. He was sitting at the dinette table with a Madonna-faced Latino woman of about 40 asking questions of her. Father Wykasik heard him call her Mrs. Mendoza and recording her answers on legal-looking forms. She was trying to cooperate but was distracted as she glanced repeatedly at a man her own age, probably her husband, who was pacing back and forth with a child in his arms. The child was a cute boy of about 6. Mr. Mendoza held the child in one burly arm, talking constantly to him, patting him, ruffling his thick hair. Obviously, this man had almost lost his son in whatever violence had occurred here, and he needed to touch and hold the child to convince himself that the worst had not actually happened. One of the patrolmen noticed Stefan and said, "Father Wykasik?" The officer's voice was soft, but at the mention of Stefan's name, the entire group fell silent. Stefan could not remember ever seeing expressions quite like those that came over the faces of the people in the Mendoza's small apartment, as if he were expected to deliver unto them a single sentence that would shed light upon all the mysteries of existence and succinctly convey the meaning of life. What in the world is going on here? Stefan wondered uneasily. "This way, Father," said a uniformed officer. Pulling off his gloves, Stefan followed the officer across the room. The hush prevailed, and everyone made way for the priest and his guide. They went into a pin-neat bedroom where Winton Tolk and another officer were sitting on the edge of the bed. "Father Wykasik's here," Stefan's guide said, then retreated to the living room. Tolk was sitting bent forward, his elbows on his knees, his face hidden in his hands. He did not look up. The other officer rose from the edge of the bed and introduced himself as Paul Arms, Winton's partner. I think you'd better get it directly from Wynn," Arms said. "I'll give you some privacy." He left, closing the door behind him. The bedroom was small, with space for only the bed, 1 nightstand, a half-size dresser, 1 chair. Father Wykasik pulled the chair around to face the foot of the bed and sat down so he could look directly at Winton Tolk. Their knees were almost touching. Removing his scarf, Father Wykasik said, "Winton, what's happened?" Tolk looked up, and Stefan was startled by the man's expression. He had thought Tolk was upset by whatever had happened in the living room, but his face revealed that he was exhilarated, filled with an excitement he could barely contain. Simultaneously, he seemed fearful, not terrified, not quaking with fear, but troubled by something that prevented him from giving in completely, happily, to his excitement. "Father, who is Brendan Cronin?" The tremor in the big man's voice was of an odd character that might have betrayed either incipient joy or terror. "What is Brendan Cronin?" Stefan hesitated, decided on the full truth. "He's a priest." Winton shook his head. "But that's not what we were told." Stefan sighed, nodded. He explained about Brendan's loss of faith and about the unconventional therapy that had included a week in a police patrol car. You and Officer Arms weren't told he was a priest because you might have treated him differently, and because I wished to spare him embarrassment. A fallen priest, Winton said, looking baffled. Not fallen, Father Waxwick said confidently, merely faltering. He'll regain his faith in time. The room's inadequate light came from a dim lamp on the nightstand and from a single narrow window, leaving the dark policeman in velvet gloom. The whites of his eyes were twin lamps, very bright by contrast with the darkness of shadows and genetic heritage. How did Brendan heal me when I was shot? How did he perform that miracle? How? Why have you decided it was a miracle? I was shot twice in the chest, point blank. 3 days later, I left the hospital. 3 days. In 10 days, I was ready to go back to work, but they made me stay home 2 weeks. Doctors kept talking about my hardy physical condition, the extraordinary healing that's possible if a body's in tip-top shape. I started thinking they were trying to explain my recovery not to me, but to themselves. But I still figured I was just really lucky. I came back to work a week ago, and then something else happened. Winton unbuttoned his shirt, pulled it open, and lifted his undershirt to reveal his bare chest. The scars. Father Waxwick shivered. Though he was close to Winton, he leaned closer, staring in amazement. The man's chest was unmarked. Well, not entirely unmarked, but the entry wounds had already healed until there were just discolored spots as big as dimes. The surgeon's incisions had almost vanished, thin lines visible now only on close inspection. This soon after major trauma, some swelling and inflammation should have been evident, but there was none. The minimal scar tissue was pale pink-brown against dark brown skin, neither lumpy nor puckered. I've seen other guys with old bullet wounds, Winton said, his excitement still restrained by a rope of fear. Lots of them. Gnarly, thick, ugly. You don't take 2 .38s in the chest, undergo major surgery, and look like this 3 weeks later, or ever. When's the last time you visited your doctor? Has he seen this? Winton rebuttoned his shirt with trembling hands. I saw Dr. Sonneferd a week ago. The sutures hadn't been removed long before. My chest was still a mess. It's only been the past 4 days that the scars melted away. I swear, Father, if I stand at a mirror long enough, I can see them fading. Finishing with his shirt buttons, Winton said, lately I've been thinking about your visit to the hospital Christmas Day. The more I've gone over it in my mind, the more it seems your behavior was peculiar. I remember some of what you said, some of the questions you asked about Brendan, and I start wondering. One thing I wonder about, one thing I've got to know, is whether Brendan Cronin ever healed anyone else. Yes, nothing as dramatic as your case, but there's another. I'm not at liberty to reveal who, Stefan said, but this isn't why you called the rectory, Winton, not to show Brendan how well you've healed. Your voice was so full of urgency, even panic. And what about all these policemen with the Mendozas? What's happened here, Winton? A mercurial smile appeared on and quickly faded from the man's broad face, followed by a transient glimmer of fear. Emotional turmoil was also evident in his voice. We're cruising, me and Paul. We get a call, this address. We get here, find a 16-year-old kid high on PCP. You know what they're like on PCP sometimes? Crazy. Animals. Damn stuff eats brain cells. Later, after it's over, we find out his name's Ernesto, son of Mrs. Mendoza's sister. He came to live here a week ago because his mother can't control him anymore. The Mendozas, they're good people. You see how they keep this place? Father Waxwick nodded. Winton said, the kind of people take in a nephew when he's gone wrong, try to set him straight. But you can't set a kid like that straight. You break your heart trying, Father. This Ernesto, he's been in trouble since he was in 5th grade. Juvenile arrest record, 6 offenses, 2 of them pretty serious. We got here, he's naked as a jaybird, screaming his head off, eyes bugged out like the pressure in his head's going to blow his skull apart. Winton's gaze unfocused, as if he were seeing back into time and had as clear a view of that scene as when he had first encountered it. Ernesto's got Hector, the little boy you probably saw when you came in. He's got him down on the sofa holding him, and he's got a goddamn 6-inch switchblade at Hector's throat. Mr. Mendoza, well, he's going crazy, wanting to rush Ernesto and take the knife, but scared Ernesto will slash Hector. Ernesto's screaming. He was blissed on angel dust. He's PCP crazy, and you can't talk sense to him. We drew our guns because you don't just walk up to some doped-out freak with a knife and shake hands. But we didn't want to try to shoot him because he had the knife at Hector's throat. Hector was crying, and Ernesto could have killed the kid if we made the wrong move. So we tried to talk him down, talk him away from Hector. And we seemed to make headway because he started to take the knife off the boy. But then all of a sudden, Jesus, he slashed quick, cut Hector's throat almost from ear to ear, deep. Winton shuddered deep. Then he raised the knife over his head, so we shot him. I'm not sure how many times, blew him away, and he fell dead on top of Hector. We pulled him off, and there was little Hector, one hand trying to close up the hole in his throat, blood spurting between his fingers, eyes already glazing over. The cop took a deep breath and shuddered again. His eyes came back into focus, as if he needed to retreat from the horror of the past. He looked toward the window, beyond which the gray winter daylight sifted like soot over the gray uptown street. Stefan's heart had begun to pound, not because of the bloody horror that Winston had described, but because he could see where the cop's story had to be leading, and he was eager to hear the miracle described. Looking at the window, Winton continued. His voice grew shakier as he spoke. There's no first aid for that kind of wound, Father. Severed arteries, veins, big arteries in the neck. Blood pumps out like water from a hose, and you can't use a tourniquet, not on a neck. And direct pressure won't seal up a carotid artery. Shit, no. I knelt on the floor beside the sofa, and I saw Hector was dying fast. He looked so little, Father, so little. That kind of wound, they're gone in 2 minutes, sometimes a lot less, and he was so little. I knew it was useless, but I put my hands on Hector's neck, like somehow I could hold the blood in him, hold the life in him. I was sick, angry, scared, and it just wasn't right that a boy so little should die that way, that hard. Not right he should die at all, not right. And then he healed, Father Wachsig said softly. Winton Tolk finally looked away from the gray light at the window and met Stefan's eyes. Yes, Father, he healed. He was soaked in his own blood, seconds away from death, but he healed. I didn't even know what was happening, didn't feel it happening, nothing special in my hands. Wouldn't you think I'd feel something special in my hands? But the first I realized that something incredible was happening was when the blood stopped spurting against my fingers, and the boy shut his eyes at the same time, which was when I thought he was dead for sure. And I shouted, "No, God, no!" And I started to take my hands away from Hector's throat to look at it, and that's when I saw the wound was closed up. It still had a raw, ugly look to it, an awful line where the knife cut deep, but the flesh was knit together into a bright red scar, a healing scar. The big man stopped speaking because shimmery lenses of tears had formed over his eyes. He was overcome once more. If he'd been racked by grief, he probably would have suppressed it, but this was something even more powerful, joy. Pure, wild, disbelieving joy. He could not contain several explosive, wrenching sobs. With hot tears in his own eyes, Father Wachsig held out both hands. Winton took them, squeezed them tight, and did not let go as he continued. Paul, my partner, saw it happen. So did the Mendozas. And 2 other uniforms arrived just as we shot Ernesto. They saw it too. And when I looked at that red line across his throat, somehow I knew what I had to do. I put my hands on the boy again, covered up the wound again, and I thought about him being alive, sort of wished him alive. My mind was in high gear, and I made the connection with Brendan and me, the sandwich shop. I thought about how the scars on my chest had been disappearing the last few days, and I knew somehow it's connected. So I kept my hands on his throat, and in a minute or so he opened his eyes. He smiled at me. You should have seen that smile, Father. So I took my hands away again, and the scar was there, but lighter. The boy sat up and asked for his mother, and that's when I went to pieces. Winton paused and gulped some air. Mrs. Mendoza took Hector into the bathroom, stripped him out of his bloody clothes, bathed him, and all the time more people from the department kept showing up. Word was getting around. Thank God the reporters haven't gotten to it yet. For a while, the 2 men sat facing each other in silence, gripping hands. Then Stefan said, "Did you try to bring Ernesto back?" "Yes. In spite of what he'd done, I put my hands on his wounds. But it didn't work with him, Father. Maybe because he was already dead. Hector was only dying, not yet gone. But Ernesto was dead." "Did you notice odd marks in your hands, on your palms? Red rings of swollen flesh?" "Nothing like that. What would it have meant if there'd been rings?" "I don't know," Father Wyckoff said, "but they appear in Brendan's hands when these things happen." They were silent again, and then Winton said, Is Father Cronin some kind of saint?" Father Wyckoff smiled. "He's a good man, but he's no saint." "Then how did he heal me?" "I don't know precisely, but surely it's a manifestation of the power of God. Somehow, for some reason." "But how did Brendan pass along this power to heal?" "I don't know, Winton. If he did pass it along, maybe the power isn't yours. Maybe it's just God acting through you. First through Brendan and then through you." At last, Winton let go of Father Wyckoff's hands. He turned his palms up and stared at them. No, the power's still here, still in me, I know that. Somehow, I feel it. And not just the power to heal, there's more." Father Wyckoff raised his eyebrows. "More? What else?" Winton frowned. "I don't know yet. It's all so new, so strange. But I feel more. It'll take time for it to develop." He looked up from the pale palms of his calloused black hands, awe-stricken and fearful. "What is Father Cronin, and what has he made of me?" "Winton, get rid of the notion there's anything evil or dangerous about this. It's entirely a wondrous thing. Think of Hector, the child you saved. Remember what it was like to feel life regaining its hold in his small body. We're players in a divine mystery, Winton. We can't understand the meaning of it until God allows us to understand." Father Wyckoff said he wanted to have a look at the boy, Hector Mendoza, and Winton said, "I'm not ready to go out there and face that crowd, even though they're mostly my people. I'll stay here a while. You'll come back?" "I've got other rather urgent business this morning, Winton. I have to get on with it soon, but I'll be in touch with you. Oh, you can be sure of that. And if you need me, just call St. Bet's." When Stefan left the bedroom, the waiting crowd of policemen and lab technicians fell silent as before. They parted in his path, and he crossed to the dinette table, where little Hector was now perched on his mother's lap, nibbling happily at a Hershey bar with almonds. The boy was small, even for a 6-year-old, with delicate facial bones. His eyes were bright and full of intelligence, proof that he'd suffered no brain damage in spite of losing most of his blood. But even more astonishing was the fact that his lost blood had evidently been replaced without need of transfusions, which made the boy's recovery even more miraculous than Tolk's. The power in Winton's hands seemed greater than it had been in Brendan's. When Father Waxy stooped down to be at eye level with Hector, the child grinned at him. "How are you feeling, Hector?" "Okay," the boy said shyly. "Do you remember what happened to you, Hector?" The child licked chocolate from his lips and shook his head no. "Is that a good candy bar?" The boy nodded and offered Father Waxy a bite. The priest smiled. "Thank you, Hector, but that's all yours." "Mama might give you one," Hector said, "but don't drop any on the carpet. That's big trouble." Stefan looked up at Mrs. Mendoza. "He really doesn't remember?" "No," she said. "God lifted the memory from him, Father." "You're Catholic, Mrs. Mendoza?" "Yes, Father," she said, crossing herself with her free hand. "Do you attend Our Lady of Sorrow?" "Yes, well, that's Father Nilo's parish. Have you called him?" "No, Father, I didn't know if—" Father Waxy looked up at Mr. Mendoza, who stood on the other side of his wife's chair. "Call Father Nilo. Tell him what's happened. Ask him to come. Explain that I'll be gone when he gets here, but that I'll talk to him later. Explain that I've much to tell him, that what he sees here isn't the whole story." Mr. Mendoza hurried to the telephone. Looking up at one of the detectives who had come close, Stefan said, "Have you taken pictures of the boy's throat wound?" The detective nodded. "Yeah, standard procedure." He laughed nervously. "What am I saying? There's nothing standard about this." "Just so you have photographs to prove this happened," Father Waxy said, "because I think soon there will be little or no scar." He turned to the boy again. "Now, Hector, if it's okay, I'd like to touch your throat. I'd like to feel that mark." The boy lowered the candy bar. Father Waxy's fingers were trembling when they touched the fiery scar tissue and moved slowly around the boy's neck from one end of the wound to the other. A strong pulse beat in the crowded arteries on each side of the slender young throat, and Stefan's heart leapt when he felt the miracle of life. Death had been defeated here, and Stefan believed he had been privileged to witness a fulfillment of the promise which was at the root of the Church's existence. "Death shall not last. Unto you shall be given life everlasting." Tears rose in the priest's eyes. When at last Stefan reluctantly took his hand away from the boy and stood, one of the policemen said, "What's it mean, Father? I heard you tell Mr. Mendoza this wasn't the whole story. What's happening?" Stefan turned to look at the assembly, which now numbered 20. In their faces he saw a longing to believe, not particularly in the truths of Catholicism or Christianity, for not all were Catholics or Christians, but a deep-seated longing to believe in something greater and better and cleaner than humankind, an intense yearning for spiritual transcendence. "What's it mean, Father?" one of them asked again. "Something's happening," he told them, "here, elsewhere, a great and wonderful something. This child is part of it. I can't tell you for sure what it means, or that we've seen the hand of God here, though I believe we have. Look at Hector on his mother's lap, eating candy, and remember God's promise. There shall be no more death, neither sorrow nor crying, neither shall there be any more pain, for the former things are passed away. In my heart of hearts, I feel that the former things are about to pass away. Now I must go. I've urgent business." Somewhat to his surprise, even though his explanation had been vague, they parted to make way for him, and did not detain him further, perhaps because the miracle of Hector Mendoza had not been vague, had in fact been emphatically specific, and had already given them more answers than they could handle. But as Stefan went, some reached out to touch him, to squeeze his hand or shoulder, not with religious fervor, but with an emotional camaraderie. Stefan was overcome by the need to touch them as well, to share a profound sense of the community of humankind, which had filled everyone in the room, to share the conviction that they were being swept towards some great destiny. In Boston at 10 o'clock, Alexander Christopherson, former United States Senator and Ambassador to Great Britain, former Director of the CIA, now retired for a decade, was reading the morning newspaper when he received a telephone call from his brother, Philip, the antique dealer in Greenwich, Connecticut. They spoke for 5 minutes about nothing important, just two brothers keeping in touch. But the conversation had a secret purpose. At the end, Philip said, "Oh, by the way, I spoke with Diana just this morning. Do you remember her?" "I certainly do," Alex said. "How's she doing?" "Oh, she has her troubles," Philip said, too boring to discuss, "but she says hello." Then he changed the subject, recommending 2 new books that Alex might enjoy, as if Diana were of no real importance. Diana was the code word that meant Ginger Weiss had phoned Philip and needed to speak with Alex. The moment he had seen Ginger at Pablo's funeral, her silver blonde hair a shimmer as if with a light of its own, she had made him think of Diana, goddess of the moon. After he said goodbye to Philip, he told his wife Elena that he intended to drive to the mall. "I want to stop at the bookstore and pick up a couple of novels that Philip recommended." He actually went to the mall, but before he bought the books, he found a public phone booth and, using his AT&T credit card, called Philip to get the number that Ginger Weiss had left. "She says it's a payphone in Elko, Nevada," Philip told him. When Alex put the Nevada call through, Ginger Weiss did not answer until the 5th ring. "Sorry," she said. "I was in the car parked beside the booth. It was just too cold to stand here and wait." "What are you doing in Nevada?" Alex asked. "If I understood you correctly, at Pablo's funeral, you really don't want me to answer questions like that." "Right, less I know the better. What did you want to ask me?" She explained with a minimum of detail that she had found others suffering from memory blocks similar to hers, some with different false memories covering the same time span. Since Alex was the expert on brainwashing, Ginger wanted to know if implanting fake memories that included threads of reality was more difficult than implanting entirely false recollections, and he was able to assure her that indeed it was. "That's what we figured," Ginger said, "but it's good to hear you confirm it. Shows we're on the right track." "Now, one more thing. I want you to get some information for us. We need to know whatever you can learn about a Colonel Leland Falkirk, an officer in one of the Army's elite Darrow companies. I also need—" Wait, Alex said, looking nervously through the glass door of the booth at shoppers walking past in the mall, as if he were already under observation or even targeted for removal. "At the cemetery, I said I'd provide advice or background on mind control techniques, but I warned you I wouldn't dig up information. I explained my position." "Well, even though you've been retired for years, you must still know people in many of the right places." "Didn't you hear me, Doctor? I will not get actively involved in your problems. I simply can't afford to. I've got too much to lose." "Now, don't worry about digging up anything exotic or highly classified. We don't expect that," she said, as if she had not heard him. "Just the bare details of Falkirk's service record might help us understand him and form an idea of what to expect from him." "Please, but she was indefatigable. "I also need to know about the Thunderhill Depository, an Army facility here in Elko County." "No. It's supposed to be an underground storage facility, and maybe that's all it was for a long time, or maybe it's always been something else. But I know it's not just an underground warehouse these days." "Doctor, I won't do this for you." "Colonel Leland Falkirk and Thunderhill Depository. It's not so much to ask. No deep snooping, just what details you can glean. Talk to your old friends who are still in the game. Then report to either Dr. George Hannaby there in Boston or to Father Stefan Wygazik, a priest in Chicago. She gave him phone numbers. I can get in touch with them and they won't mention your name when they tell me what you've reported. That way you don't have to call me direct and you stay in the clear. He tried and failed to control the palsied shaking of his hands. Doctor, I'm sorry I volunteered even limited assistance. I'm an old man who's afraid to die. You're also worried about sins you might have committed in the name of duty, she said, repeating what he'd told her at the cemetery. And you'd probably like to do something to atone for some of those sins, real or imagined. This would be atonement of a sort, Mr. Christopherson. She repeated the telephone numbers for Hannaby and Wygazik. No. If you're interrogated, remember I said no. Emphatically no. With maddening good cheer, she said, Oh, and it would help if you had something for me within the next 6 or 8 hours. I know that's a tall order, but then again, I'm only asking for basic information, whatever's in the unclassified files. Goodbye, Doctor, he said pointedly. I'll look forward to hearing from you. You will not hear from me. Toodaloo, she said, and hung up on him first. Christ, he said, slamming the receiver down. She was an attractive woman, personable, intelligent, appealing in so many ways, but her absolute conviction that she would always get what she wanted, that was a trait he sometimes admired in a man, seldom or never in a woman. Well, she'd be disappointed this time. This time she'd not get what she wanted. Damned if she would. Yet, with his crossed pen, he had made note of the telephone numbers for Hannaby and Wygazik, which she had given him. Dom and Ernie set out early Tuesday morning to reconnoiter at least part of the perimeter of Thunderhill Depository. They went in Jack Twist's new Jeep Cherokee. Jack himself was sleeping back at the motel, having gone to bed only a few hours ago, after spending half the night driving around Elko, staying on the move with Brendan Cronin and Georgia Monatella. Both the Cherokee and the motel's Dodge van had four-wheel drive, but the Jeep was tougher, more maneuverable. The foothill and mountain roads up toward Thunderhill might be icy in spots, and as the day promised new snow, they wanted the most reliable transportation. Dom did not like the look of the sky. Thick, dark clouds hung low over the high plains, lower over the foothills, and obscured the tops of the mountains. The weather forecast called for the first big storm of the year, later than usual this season, as much as 14 inches of snow in the higher elevations. Not a single flake had fallen yet. The raised and threatening lash of winter did not induce a pensive mood in Dom or Ernie. They were in high spirits upon setting out from the motel. They were finally doing something, acting, not just reacting. In addition, there was the pleasant fellowship that exists when men who like each other set out on an adventure together, a fishing trip or an expedition to a ballpark, or a scouting trip to explore the perimeter defenses of a military installation. In no little measure, their excellent mood grew from the unexpected peacefulness of the night just past. For the first time in weeks, Dom's sleep hadn't been disturbed by nightmares or sleepwalking. He dreamed only of an undetailed chamber filled with golden light, evidently the same place that featured in Brendan's dreams. Likewise, instead of lying awake in fear of the shadows beyond the glow of the bedside lamp, Ernie had drifted off to sleep at once. The others also said it was the most restful night in recent memory. Ginger's theory, put forth over a quick cup of coffee this morning, was that their worst dreams had been related not to the mysterious events they'd witnessed on the night of July 6th, but to the subsequent brainwashing. Therefore, now that they had an idea of what they'd endured at the hands of the mind control experts, the subconscious pressure related to those experiences was relieved, eliminating the source of those particular bad dreams. And Dom had a reason of his own to feel good about the day. This morning, no one had looked warily at him or treated him with deference because of his telekinetic power. At first, he was baffled by their quick adjustment to his new status. Then he realized what must be going through their minds. Since they had shared his experiences of the summer before last, it was logical that they would also share his strange power sooner or later. They must believe their own development of paranormal abilities was merely lagging behind his. Eventually, if they did not acquire the power, they might build the emotional, intellectual, and psychological walls between them and him that would isolate him as he feared. But for the moment anyway, they were acting as if no gulf separated them from him, and he was grateful. Now, humming softly, Ernie drove north on the Tulane County Road, leaving the motel and the interstate behind them. They climbed some of the same rugged hills down which Jack Twist had come last night when making his clandestine approach to the Tranquility, although Jack had traveled overland. And Dom studied the changing terrain with interest. The rising land seemed leaner the higher it rose, revealing less flesh and more rocky bones that poked up everywhere, in clavicles and scapulae and sternums of limestone, in fibulae and femurs of crumbling shale, and occasional ribs and spines of formidable granite. As if in awareness of the colder air of higher altitudes, the land wore more close, thicker petticoats of grass, more lavish skirts of sage and other bushes, then trees, more trees, mountain mahogany, tall pines, cedar, quaking aspen, and on eastern slopes an occasional spruce or fir. They had gone only 3 miles when they reached the snow line. A thin mantle flanked the road at first, but in the next 2 miles it deepened to 8 inches. Although winter drought had held sway from September until early December, and although no major storm had swept the area yet this season, a few light snows had put down a respectable ground cover, also frosting the bristle boughs of the evergreens. But for a few small, scattered patches of ice, the county road was cleared for easy travel. They always keep it clean as far as Thunder Hill, even in killing weather, Ernie explained. But up beyond the depository, the road crews don't do as thorough a job. In no time they had gone 10 miles, always following the crest of the valley that fell away on the east, and always with rising mountains on the west. They passed several dirt and gravel lanes leading to isolated homes and ranches in the eastward sloping lands to their right, and at the 10-mile point they reached the guarded entrance road to Thunder Hill Depository, also on the right. Ernie slowed the Cherokee but did not turn into the entranceway. Haven't been this far up here in a long time. They've made changes since I saw the place last. Didn't used to look this formidable. A sign announced the depository. Beside the sign, another paved road branched off the county lane, leading away between towering pines of such a dark green hue they seemed nearly black in the somber pre-storm light. 15 feet in from the turnoff, the lane was blocked by long metal spikes that speared up from the pavement, precisely angled to puncture the tires of any vehicle that tried to proceed further, but also large enough to catch on the axle of a hurtling truck or car and instantly arrest its progress. 20 feet beyond the spikes there was a massive steel grate crowned with spears painted red. A concrete block guardhouse, 20 feet by 10, stood inside the gate, and its black metal door looked capable of withstanding a bazooka barrage. Ernie pulled to the edge of the main road and slowed almost to a full stop as they eased past the entrance to Thunder Hill. He pointed to a yard square post at the verge of the entrance lane, just this side of the wicked spikes. Looks like an intercom to the guardhouse. Not just a voice link either. One of those systems like they have in drive-in banks, with a video monitor so they can see you in your car. The man in the guardhouse approves a visitor before the road spikes lower and the gate opens. Even then, I'll bet they're permanently emplaced machine guns to take you out if the guard decides he's been duped after he's already opened the gates. From each end of the gate, an 8-foot-high chain-link fence with a barbed wire overhang disappeared into the trees, and Dom noted a white sign with red lettering that warned, "Danger, electrified." Although the perimeter fence led into the forest, no trees overhung it. From the small sections that he could see flanking the main gate, there appeared to be a 20-foot wide no-man's land on each side. Dom's good mood faded. He thought that the security along the perimeter of the facility would be minimal. After all, once you got onto the grounds, the actual entrance to Thunderhill was through 8 or 10-foot thick blast doors set in the hillside. That barrier was so impregnable that it seemed wasteful to install maximum security around the entire outer edge of the property. Yet that was what they had done, which meant the secret they were guarding was so important that they did not even trust nuclear-proof doors and subterranean limestone vaults to keep it safe. The spikes in the road are new, Ernie said, and the gate they had a couple of years ago was pretty flimsy by comparison. The fence was always here, but it wasn't electrified before. We've no hope at all of getting a look inside. Although no one had said as much for fear of sounding foolish, they all hoped they might get as far as the blast doors of the facility, have a look around the newly expanded grounds that had been taken from ranchers Brust and Dirksen, and be fortunate enough to stumble across another piece of the puzzle they were committed to solve. Dom had never imagined they would actually get inside the underground rooms of Thunderhill. That was an improbable scenario. But from the comfort of the Tranquility Motel, getting onto the grounds and snooping around had not seemed like an impossible dream. Until now. Dom wondered if his newly discovered telekinetic powers might be used to circumvent the depository's fortifications, but he dismissed that thought as quickly as it occurred to him. Until he could control the gift, it was of little use. It scared him. He sensed that the power was sufficient to cause tremendous destruction and death if he lost control of it, and he would not take the chance again, except under very tightly controlled conditions. "Well," Ernie said, "it was never our intention to try waltzing through the front gate. Let's have a look along some of the perimeter fence." He touched his foot lightly on the accelerator. Looking in the rearview mirror, he said, "Oh, and by the way, we're being followed." Startled, Dom turned and looked through the rear window of the Cherokee. Less than 100 yards behind was a pickup truck, an all-terrain job, loftily perched on tires twice as wide and more than twice as high as ordinary tires. Spotlights, currently unlit, were mounted on the roof, and a snowplow currently raised off the road was fitted to the front. Although Dom was certain that private citizens living in the mountains might own similar trucks, this one had the look of a military vehicle. The windshield was tinted, the driver unrevealed. He said, "You sure they're following us? When did they show up?" Piloting the Cherokee up the county road, Ernie said, "I noticed them about half a mile after we left the motel. When we slow down, they slow down too. When we speed up, so do they." "You think there's going to be trouble?" "There will be if they ask for it. They're probably only army pussies," Ernie said. He grinned. Dom laughed. "Don't get me in a war just to prove leathernecks are tougher than GIs. I'll happily accept your word for it." The road became steeper. The somber ashen sky grew lower. The dark trees drew closer on both sides. The pickup stayed behind them. Mrs. Halborg, Emmy's mother, answered the door, letting a puff of warm air out of the house into the frigid Chicago morning. Father Wyckoff said, "Sorry to come unannounced like this, but the most extraordinary thing is happening, and I had to find out if Emmy..." He stopped in mid-sentence when he realized that Mrs. Halborg was in terrible distress. Her eyes were wide with shock, with fear too. Before he could ask what was wrong, she said, "My God, it's you, Father. From the hospital, I remember." "But how did you know to come? We haven't called anyone yet. How'd you know to come?" "What's happened?" Rather than answer, she took him by the arm, ushered him inside, slammed the door, and hurried him upstairs. "This way, quickly." Coming directly from the Mendoza's apartment uptown, he expected to find something odd at the Halborg place, but not this state of crisis. When they reached the second-floor hallway, Mr. Halborg was there with one of Emmy's older sisters. They were standing halfway down the hall at an open door, staring into a room at something that seemed equally to attract and repel them. In the room, something thumped, rattled, then thumped twice again, followed by a musical burst of girlish laughter. Mr. Halborg turned, a ghastly expression on his face, and blinked in surprise at Stefan. "Father, thank God you're here. We didn't know what to do. Didn't want to make complete fools of ourselves by calling for help and then maybe nothing's happening when help gets here, you know. But now you've come, so it's settled, and I'm relieved." Stefan looked warily through the open doorway and saw the usual accoutrements of a bedroom occupied by a girl of 10 going on 11, the changing age between childhood and adolescence. Half a dozen teddy bears, big posters of the current teenage idols, boys utterly unknown to Stefan. A wooden hat rack hung with a collection of exotic chapeaux, probably purchased from thrift shops. Roller skates, a tape deck, a flute lying in an open case. Emmy's other sister, in a white sweater, tartan plaid skirt, and knee socks, was standing a few feet inside the room, pale and half paralyzed. Emmy was standing up in bed, pajama-clad, looking even healthier than on Christmas Day. She was hugging a pillow, grinning at the same astonishing performance, a poltergeist at play, that riveted her sister and frightened the rest of her family. As Father Wyckoff stepped into the room, Emmy laughed delightedly at the antics of two small teddy bears waltzing in midair. Their movements were nearly as precise and formal as those of real dancers. But the bears were not the only inanimate objects infused with magical life. The roller skates were not standing still in a corner, but were moving about on separate courses. This one past the foot of the bed and then to the closet door, that one to the desk, this one to the window, moving fast, then slow. The hats jiggled on the rack. A Care Bear on a bookshelf bounced up and down. Stefan went to the foot of the bed, careful to avoid the roller skates, and looked up at Emmy, who still stood on the mattress. "Emmy?" The girl glanced down at him. "Pudge's friend. Hello, Father. Isn't it terrific? Isn't it wild?" "Emmy, is this you?" he asked, gesturing at the capering objects. "Me?" she said, genuinely surprised. "No, not me." But he noticed that the flying, waltzing bears faltered when she turned her attention away from them. They did not drop to the floor, but bobbled and turned and bumped against one another in a clumsy and aimless manner quite different from their previous measured grace. He also saw indications that the previous phenomena had not all been this harmless. A ceramic lamp had been knocked to the floor and broken. One of the posters was torn. The dresser mirror was cracked. Seeing the direction of his gaze, Emmy said, "It was scary at first, but it calmed down, and now it's just fun. Isn't it fun?" As she was speaking, the flute rose out of the open carrying case, up and up, until it was about 7 feet off the floor, only a few feet to the left of the floating teddy bears. Out of the corner of her eye, the girl caught a glimpse of the rising instrument. When she turned to look directly at the flute, sweet music began to issue from it, not just random notes, but a well-executed tune. Emmy jumped up and down on the bed excitedly. That's Annie's song. I used to play that. You're playing it now, Stefan said. Oh, no, she said, still staring at the flute. My hands got so bad, my knuckle joints, that I had to give up the flute a year ago. I'm cured now, but my hands still aren't good enough to play. Stefan said, but you aren't using your hands to play it, Emmy. His meaning finally penetrated. She looked down at him. Me? Deprived of her focused attention, the flute produced only a few more poorly executed notes and fell silent. It still hung in the air, but now it bobbled and dipped erratically. Emmy returned her attention to the instrument. It steadied in the air and began to play again. Me, she said wonderingly. She turned to her sister, who was still paralyzed by fear and amazement. Me, Emmy said, then looked at her parents, who were standing in the doorway. Me! Stefan appreciated what the child must be feeling, and his throat was pinched so tightly with emotion that he had difficulty swallowing. A month ago she'd been a cripple, unable to dress herself, with nothing to look forward to except further deterioration, pain, and death. Now she was not only cured and her damaged bones reknit, but she was also in possession of this spectacular gift. Father Wachsig wanted to tell her that somehow this gift had been given to her unwittingly by Brendan Cronin, her pudge, but then he would have to explain where Brendan had gotten his gift, and he could not do that. Besides, he hadn't time even to tell them what he did know. It was 9:15. He should have been in Evanston by now. Time was of the essence, for Stefan was beginning to suspect that he would be catching a flight for Nevada before the day ended. Whatever was happening in Elko County was bound to be even more incredible than what was happening here, and he was determined to be a part of it. Emmy looked at the floating bears, and they resumed their formal dance once more. She giggled. Stefan thought about what Winton Tolk had said only a short while ago in the Mendoza's uptown apartment. The power's still here, still in me. I know. I feel it. And not just the power to heal. There's more. Winton had not known what powers he might possess in addition to the healing touch, but Stefan suspected that the policeman was in for some surprises similar to those that had thrown the Halborg household into turmoil. Father, will you do it yourself? Mr. Halborg asked from the doorway where he stood with his wife, his voice sharp with anxiety. Mrs. Halborg said, please, we want it to be done as soon as possible. Immediately. Can't you begin at once? Baffled, Stefan said, I'm sorry, but what is it you want done? Mr. Halborg said, an exorcism, of course. Stefan stared at them incredulously, only now fully realizing why they had been in such distress when he had arrived, and why they had greeted him with such relief. He laughed. There won't be any need for an exorcism. This isn't Satan at work. Oh, no. My heavens, no. From the corner of his eye, Stefan saw movement on the floor. He looked down at a 2-foot-high teddy bear that was tottering past him on stiff little stuffed legs. When Tolk had said that he sensed he would need a long time to learn what his powers were and to be able to control them, either he was wrong or the task was far easier for Emmy than for him. That might be the case. Children were much more adaptable than adults. Emmy's parents and her other sister edged into the room, fascinated but wary. Stefan understood their wariness. All seemed well, the power benign, but the situation was so awesome, so profoundly affecting on a primitive level, that even an unfaltering optimist like Stefan Wachsig felt a tingle of fear. After using a payphone at a Shell service station in Elko to get in touch with Alexander Christopherson in Boston, Ginger accompanied Faye to Elroy and Nancy Jameson's ranch in the Lemuel Valley, 20 miles from Elko. The Jamisons were the Bach's friends who had been visiting on the evening of July 6th, the summer before last. They had surely been caught up in the unknown events of that night and had been detained at the motel for brainwashing with everyone else, though they remembered differently, of course. According to their program of false memories, they had been allowed to evacuate the danger zone, taking Ernie and Faye with them. They believed they had returned to their small ranch, where they and the Bachs had passed the next few days. That was also what Faye and Ernie had believed, until recently. Ginger and Faye were paying a visit to the Jamisons, not to inform them of what had actually happened, but to determine as indirectly as possible if the Jamisons were having troubles of the kind afflicting Ginger, Ernie, Dom, and some of the others. If they were suffering, they would be brought into the mutually supportive community at the motel, the members of which had come to think of themselves as the Tranquility Family, and would join the search for answers. But if the brainwashing had been effective, the Jamisons would not be told anything. To tell the Jamisons would be to endanger them. Besides, given the urgent strategy developed last night with Jack Twist, if the Jamisons were not already suffering, there was no point wasting a lot of time convincing them that they'd been brainwashed. Time was precious, and every passing hour carried the Tranquility Family deeper into danger. Jack believed and convinced Ginger that their enemies would soon move against them. The drive from Elko in the motel's van was quick and scenic. The picturesque Lemuel Valley, 15 miles long, 4 miles wide, began at the foot of the Ruby Mountains. Wheat, barley, and potato farms occupied the lowlands, though the fields were unplanted now, slumbering under scattered patches of snow. Between the valley floor and the mountains, the higher lands and foothills offered lush pasturage, and that was where the Jamisons had their ranch. At one time, they owned hundreds of acres on which they raised cattle, but eventually they sold off much of their property, which had risen substantially in value, and got out of the livestock business. Now in their early 60s and retired, they owned about 50 acres in the foothills, employed no ranch hands, and kept only 3 horses and a few chickens. As Faye turned off the main valley road onto a lane leading into the highlands, she said, "I think someone's following us." The back doors of the van had no windows, so Ginger looked at the side-mounted mirror. A nondescript sedan was about 100 feet behind them. "How do you know?" "Same car's been back there since the Union 76 in town." "Maybe it's coincidence," Ginger said. When they had followed the lane over halfway up the valley wall, they reached the long, narrow driveway to the Jamisons' ranch, which led half a mile back through deep shadows thrown by flanking rows of big pinyons. Faye pulled into the driveway and slowed to see what the other car would do. Instead of going past farther up into the hills, it pulled to a stop and parked along the outer lane, directly across from the entrance to the Jamisons' property. In the side view mirror, Ginger could see that the car was a late model Plymouth, painted a flat, ugly brown green. "Obviously a government heat," Faye said. "Pretty bold, aren't they?" "Well, if they've been eavesdropping on us the way Jack says, through our own telephones, then they know we're on to them, so maybe they figure there's no point in playing coy with us." Faye took her foot off the brake and headed up the driveway. Watching the unmarked Plymouth dwindle in the side mirror, Ginger said, "Or maybe they're getting in position to take us into custody. Maybe they've put tails on all of us, and maybe they're just waiting for the order to snatch us all up at the same time." On the narrow gravel driveway, the interlacing shadows of the overarching pinyons wove a darkness nearly as deep as night. As they drove up the 2-lane road through the broad snow-covered meadow toward the massive glass doors, Colonel Falkirk sat in the front passenger seat of the Wagoneer, thinking about the catastrophe that would ensue from the revelation of Thunderhill's secret. From a political perspective, this would make the Watergate mess look like a tea party. An unprecedented number of competing government institutions were involved in the cover-up, organizations that often operated in jealous opposition to one another. The FBI, CIA, National Security Agency, the United States Army, the Air Force, and others. It was a testament to the degree of potential danger that these groups could work together with nary a hitch and without a single leak in more than 18 months. But if the cover-up were uncovered, the scandal would extend throughout so much of the government that the faith of the American people in their leaders would be severely shaken. Of course, very few in any of those organizations knew it had happened. No more than 6 in the FBI, fewer in the CIA. Most of their men involved in the cover-up didn't know what they were covering up, which was why there had been no leaks, but the numero uno of each organization, the director of the FBI, the director of the CIA, the chief of staff of the Army, was completely in the know, not to mention the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and the Secretary of State, and the President, his closest advisors, the Vice President. A lot of prominent men might fall from grace if this affair was not kept under lock and key. The political destruction wrought by the release of the secret would be only a small part of the devastation. The CISG, a think tank of physicists, biologists, anthropologists, sociologists, theologists, economists, educators, and other learned people, had pondered precisely this crisis at great length and depth years before it had arisen here in Nevada. The CISG had issued a 1,220-page top-secret report on its conclusions, a document that offered some disturbing reading. Leland knew that report by heart, for he was the military representative to the CISG and had helped write several position papers, included in the final text. Within the CISG, the opinion was unanimous that the world would never be the same if such an event were to occur. All societies, all cultures would be radically changed forever. Projected deaths over the first 2 years ranged in the millions. Lieutenant Horner, who was driving the Wagoneer, braked 20 feet in front of the giant blast doors that were set in the sudden steep upper slope of the meadow. He didn't wait for the huge barriers to open, for he was not driving directly into Thunderhill. Horner turned right into a small parking lot where 3 minibuses, 4 Jeep wagons, a Land Rover, and several other vehicles stood side by side. The twin blast doors, each 30 feet high and 20 feet wide, were so thick they could be opened only at a ponderous pace, producing a rumble that could be heard a mile away and felt in the air and in the ground at least half as far. When a truck, loaded with ammunition, weapons, or supplies, pulled up in front of the drive-in entrance, the doors required 5 minutes to roll apart. Opening those hangar-sized portals every time a lone man needed to walk in or out was unthinkably inefficient. So a second man-sized door, nearly as formidable, was set in the hillside 30 feet to the right of the main entrance. There was no better vault than Thunderhill in which to keep the secret of July 6. It was an impregnable fortress. Leland and Lieutenant Horner hurried through the bitter air to the walk-in entrance. The small steel door, almost as blast-proof as the massive versions to the left, had an electronic lock that could be disengaged only by tapping the proper 4 numbers on a keyboard. The code changed every 2 weeks, and those entrusted with it were required to commit it to memory. Leland punched in the code, and the 14-inch thick lead core door slid aside with a sudden pneumatic whoosh. They stepped into a 12-foot-long concrete tunnel about 9 feet in diameter and brightly lit. It angled to the left. At the end was another door identical to the first, but it could not be opened until the outer door was closed. Leland touched a heat-sensitive switch just inside the tunnel entrance, and the outer door hissed shut behind him and Lieutenant Horner. Immediately, a pair of video cameras mounted on the ceiling at opposite ends of the chamber clicked on. The cameras tracked the two men as they walked to the inner door. No human eyes were watching the colonel and lieutenant on any video display, for the system was operated entirely by Vigilant, all in capitals, the security computer, as a precaution against the possibility that a traitor within Thunderhill's own guard unit might open the facility to hostile forces. Vigilant was not linked to the installation's main computer or to the outside world, therefore it was invulnerable to saboteurs seeking to take control of it by means of a modem or other electronic tap. The guard at the perimeter fence had notified Vigilant that Colonel Leland Falkirk and Lieutenant Thomas Horner would be arriving. Now, as they approached the inner door under the gazes of video cameras, the computer compared their appearance to stored holographic images of them, rapidly matching 42 points of facial resemblance. It was impossible to deceive Vigilant, either with makeup or with a look-alike for an approved visitor. If Leland or Horner had been an imposter or unauthorized visitor, Vigilant would have sounded an alarm, simultaneously filling the entrance tunnel with a sedative gas. The lock on the inner door had no keyboard, no code would open it. Instead, a 1-foot square panel of glass was set in the wall beside the door. Leland almost pressed his right hand palm down against the panel, hesitated, then used his left, and the glass lit, and a faint humming arose. Vigilant scanned his palm print and fingerprints, comparing them to the prints in its files. Lieutenant Horner said, "Almost as hard to get in here as into heaven." "Harder," Leland said. The light behind the milky glass winked out, and Leland took his hand away. The inner door opened. They stepped into a huge natural tunnel that had been improved by human hands. The domed rock overhead was lost in darkness because the lighting fixtures were suspended from black metal scaffolding, creating the illusion of a ceiling perhaps 20 or 30 feet below the true ceiling. The tunnel was 60 feet across and led into the mountain about 120 yards. In some places, the rock walls had natural contours, but in other places they carried the imprints of dynamite blasts and jackhammers and other tools that had been used to widen the narrow portions of the passageway. Incoming trucks could drive along the concrete floor to unloading bays beside immense cargo elevators that went down into deeper regions of the facility. A guard sat at a table beyond the door by which Leland and Horner entered. Considering the remoteness of Thunderhill, the extent of sophisticated defenses, and the thoroughness with which Vigilant examined all visitors, a lone sentry seemed superfluous to Leland. Evidently, the sentry was of that same opinion, for he was not prepared for trouble. His revolver was holstered. He was eating a candy bar. Reluctantly, he looked up from an old novel by Jack Finney. He wore a coat because the open areas of the depository were never heated. Only the enclosed living quarters and work areas were kept warm. An enormous power supply was provided by a mini hydroelectric plant that harnessed an underground river, plus backup diesel generators, but there was not enough to warm the mammoth caverns. The subterranean temperature was a stable 55 degrees, quite bearable if one dressed for long work periods in the chilly air, as the guard had done. He saluted. Colonel Falkirk, Lieutenant Horner, you're cleared to see Dr. Benno. You know how to find him, of course. Of course, Falkirk said. 10 feet to the left, the burnished steel surface of the giant blast doors glimmered softly in the fluorescent light, looking rather like the sheer face of a great glacier. Leland and Lieutenant Horner turned right, away from the big doors, and walked deeper into the mountain toward the elevators. Thunderhill Depository was equipped with hydraulic lifts of 3 sizes, the largest of which rivaled the enormous elevators on aircraft carriers. A carrier's lifts were used to bring planes from the ship's hold onto the flight deck, and Thunderhills also lowered and raised planes, among other things. In addition to $2.4 billion of equipment and material, freeze-dried food, medicine, portable field hospitals, clothing, blankets, tents, handguns, rifles, mortars, field artillery, ammunition, light military vehicles such as jeeps and armored personnel carriers, and 20 backpack nukes. The vast storage dump contained a variety of useful aircraft. First, the helicopters, 30 Sikorsky S-67 Black Hawk anti-tank gunships, 20 Bell King Cobras, 8 Anglo-French Westland Pumas, general-purpose transports, and 3 big medevac choppers. No conventional aircraft were stored at Thunderhill, but there were 12 vertical takeoff jets of the type manufactured in England by Hawker Siddeley and known there as Harriers, but which were called AV-8As when in U.S. service. Because the Harriers were equipped with powerful vectored thrust engines, the craft could land and take off vertically without need of a runway. In a grave crisis, for example, subsequent to a limited nuclear strike and a land invasion by enemy troops, the aircraft of Thunderhill, both choppers and Harriers, could be lifted to the top level, rolled out through the massive blast doors, and sent hurtling into the sky. However, the current crisis did not involve war or require the unleashing of the depository's aircraft, so Leland and the lieutenant bypassed the 2 immense elevators. They also passed the 2 smaller but still oversized cargo elevators, their footsteps echoing off the stone walls, and took one of the 3 smallest cabs, about the size of a standard lift in a hotel, down into the bowels of Thunderhill. Medical supplies, food, guns, and all ammunition were stored on the 3rd level, the bottom floor of the complex, in a network of chambers which had been caulked, equipped with pressure release bores and fitted with doors for the purpose of blast containment. On the 2nd, the middle level, all the vehicles and aircraft were kept in other huge caverns, and in there too that the staff lived and worked. And it was there too that the staff lived and worked. Leland and Lieutenant Horner got off the lift at the 2nd level. They stepped into a lighted circular rock wall chamber, 300 feet in diameter. It served as a hub. In fact, personnel called it the hub, from which 4 other caverns opened, and still more rooms lay beyond those 4. The larger of those deep vaults contained, among other things, the aircraft, jeeps, and armored personnel carriers. There were no doors on 3 of the 4 caverns which led off the hub, for there was no serious danger of fire or explosion on that level. But the 4th chamber did indeed have doors, for it contained the secret of July 6, which Leland and many others had conspired to conceal. He stopped now a few steps out of the elevator to study those portals, which were 26 feet high and 64 feet wide. They were made of cross-braced 2x4s rather than steel, because they had been jerry-built to meet an emergency situation. There had been no time to order a fabricated metal door to close off the cavern. They reminded the colonel of the enormous wooden doors in the wall that had protected the frightened natives from the beasts on the other half of their island in the original King Kong. Considering what lay behind these doors, that horror movie image did not inspire confidence. Leland shuddered. Lieutenant Horner said, "Still gives you the creeps, huh? You mean you're comfortable with it now?" "Hell no, sir. Hell no." Inset in the bottom of one of those huge wooden barriers was a much smaller man-sized door through which researchers entered and exited the room beyond. An armed guard was positioned there to allow entrance only to those with the proper pass. The activities in that forbidden chamber had nothing to do with the other primary functions of the depository, and 90% of the personnel were not permitted access to the area. Indeed, 90% did not know what was in that cavern. Around the circumference of the hub, between the openings to other caverns, buildings had been erected along the walls and anchored to the rock. The structures dated to the first year of the depository's construction, back in the early 1960s. Then they had served as offices for engineers, superintendents, and the Army's project officers. Over the years, an entire subterranean town had been erected in other caverns: sleeping quarters, cafeteria, recreation rooms, laboratories, machine shops, vehicle service center, computer rooms, even a PX, among other things. They were now occupied by the military and government personnel who were doing 1- and 2-year tours of duty at Thunder Hill. In the buildings there was heat, better lighting, inside and outside telephone lines, kitchens, bathrooms, and all the myriad comforts of home. They were constructed of metal panels coated with baked blue or white or gray enamel, with only small windows and narrow metal doors. Though they had no wheels, they somewhat resembled motorhomes or house trailers drawn in a circle, as if they were the property of a modern-day encampment of gypsies who had found their way to this snug haven 240 feet below the winter snows. Now, turning from the forbidden chamber with the wooden doors, Leland walked across the hub toward a white metal structure, Dr. Miles Bennell's offices. Lieutenant Horner fell in dutifully at his side. The summer before last, Miles Bennell, whom Leland Falkirk loathed, had moved into Thunder Hill to head all scientific inquiry into the events of that fateful July night. He'd only been out of the depository on 3 occasions since then, never for longer than 2 weeks. He was obsessed with his assignment, or something worse than obsessed. A dozen officers, enlisted men and civilians, were in sight within the hub, some crossing from one adjoining cavern to another, some just standing in conversation with one another. Leland looked them over as he passed them, unable to understand what kind of person would volunteer to work underground for weeks and months at a stretch. They were paid a 30% hardship bonus, but to Leland's way of thinking, that was inadequate compensation. The depository was less oppressive than Schenkfield's small windowless warrens, but not by much. Leland supposed he was slightly claustrophobic. Being underground made him feel as if he were buried alive. As an admitted masochist, he should have relished his discomfort, but this was one kind of pain he did not seek or enjoy. Dr. Miles Bennell looked ill. Like nearly everyone in Thunder Hill, he was pasty-faced from being too long beyond the reach of sunlight. His curly black hair and beard only made his pallor more pronounced. In the fluorescent glare of his office, he looked almost like a ghost. He greeted Leland and Lieutenant Horner curtly, and he did not offer to shake hands with either of them. That suited the colonel fine. He was no friend of Bennell's. A handshake would have been sheer hypocrisy. Besides, Leland was half afraid that Miles Bennell had been compromised, that the scientist was no longer who or what he appeared to be, was no longer entirely human. And if that crazy, paranoid possibility was in fact true, he wanted no physical contact with Benno, not even a quick handshake. Dr. Benno, Leland said coldly, using the hard tone of voice and icy demeanor that always elicited quaverous obedience. Your handling of this security breach has been either criminally inept or you're the traitor we're looking for. Now hear me loud and clear. This time we're going to find the bastard who sent those Polaroid snapshots. No more broken lie detectors, no more botched interrogations, and we're going to find out if he's the one who teased Jack Twist into returning, and we're going to come down on him so hard he'll wish he'd been born a fly and spent his life in a stable sucking up horse shit. Utterly unruffled, Miles Benno smiled and said, Colonel, that was the best Richard Jekyll impression I've ever seen, but entirely unnecessary. I am as anxious as you to find the leak and plug it. Leland wanted to punch the son of a bitch. This was one reason he loathed Miles Benno. The bastard could not be intimidated. Calvin Sharko lived on O'Bannon Lane in a pleasant middle-class residential neighborhood in Evanston. Father Wyckowick had to stop twice at service stations to ask directions. When he got to the corner of O'Bannon and Scott Avenue, only 2 blocks from Sharko's address, he was turned back by policemen manning an emergency barricade formed by 2 black and white cruisers and 1 paramedic van. There were also television crews running around with minicams. He also knew at once that the trouble on O'Bannon Lane was not merely coincidental. Something was happening at the Sharko house. In spite of temperatures in the mid-20s and wind gusting to 30 miles an hour, a crowd of about 100 had gathered outside the police barricade, on the sidewalks, and on the lawns of the corner houses. Passing traffic on Scott Avenue was slowed by gawkers, and Stefan had to drive almost 2 blocks at a frustratingly slow pace before he found a parking space. When he walked back to the crowd and became part of it, seeking information from the well-bundled onlookers, Father Wyckowick found that they were, for the most part, a friendly and strangely excited group, but creepy too, not blatantly weird. In fact, they were ordinary people, except for their totally insensitive fascination with the tragedy unfolding before them, as if it were as legitimate a source of thrills as a football game. It was definitely a tragedy, and one of a particularly horrible nature, which Father Wyckowick discovered a minute after he joined the crowd and began to ask questions. A florid-faced, mustachioed man in a plaid hunting jacket and toboggan hat said, Jesus, man, don't you watch the goddamn TV? He was not the least restrained because he did not know he was talking to a priest. Stefan's topcoat and scarf concealed all evidence of his holy office. Christ, fellow, that's Sharko's down there. Sharko the Shark, man, that's what they're calling him. Guy's a dangerous loony. Been sealed up in his house there since yesterday, man. He shot him 2 of his neighbors and 1 cop already. And he's got him 2 goddamn hostages who, if you ask me, got about as much chance as a fucking cat at a Doberman convention. Tuesday morning, via Pacific Southwest Airlines, Parker Fane flew into San Francisco from Orange County, then caught a connecting WestAir flight to Monterey. It was an hour's trip up the San Francisco coast on PSA, a 1-hour layover in San Francisco, and then only 35 minutes to Monterey. The journey seemed shorter because one of the other travelers, a pretty young woman, recognized his name, liked his paintings, and was in the mood to be enthralled by his burly charms. In Monterey, at the small airport rental agency, he hired a vomit green Ford Tempo. It was an offense to his refined sense of color. The tempo's tempo is satisfyingly allegro on flat roads, but a bit adagio on the hills. Nevertheless, he required less than half an hour to find the address Dom had given him for Gerald Salco, the man who had stayed at the Tranquility Motel with his wife and 2 daughters on the night of July 6, and who had thus far been unreachable by both phone and Western Union. It was a big Southern colonial manor house, hideously out of place on the California coast, set on a prime half-acre in the shade of massive pines with enough elaborately tended shrubbery to employ a gardener 1 full day a week, including beds of impatiens that blazed with red and purple flowers, even now in January. Parker swung the tempo into the majestic circular driveway and parked in front of broad, flower-bordered steps that led up to a deep pillared veranda. In the shadows of the trees, there was sufficient gloom to require lights indoors, but he saw none at the front windows. All the drapes were tightly shut, and the house had a vacant look. He got out of the tempo, hurried up the steps, and crossed the wide veranda, voicing his objection to the chilly air as he went brrr. The area's usual morning fog had cleared from the airport, permitting landings, but it was still clinging to this part of the peninsula, bearding the pines, weaving tendrils between their trunks, muting the impatiens' brilliant blooms. Winter in Northern California was a more bracing season than in Laguna Beach, and with the added damp chill of fog, it was not at all to Parker's taste. He had come dressed for it, however, in heavy corduroy slacks, a green plaid flannel shirt, a green pullover that mocked Izod Lacoste by featuring a goofy-looking appliqué armadillo on the breast instead of an alligator, and a 3/4-length navy peacoat with sergeant stripes on one sleeve. Quite an outfit, especially when accented by day-glow orange running shoes. As he rang the doorbell, Parker looked down at himself and decided that maybe sometimes he dressed too eccentrically, even for an artist. He rang the doorbell 6 times, waiting half a minute between each ring, but no one came. Last night, when a man named Jack Twist had called him at 11 o'clock from a payphone in Elko, claiming to have a message from Dom, and had asked him to go to a specific payphone in Laguna for a call back in 20 minutes, Parker had still been working on a new and exciting painting that he had begun at 3 o'clock that afternoon. Nevertheless, deeply involved as he was with the work, he had hastened to the booth as directed, and he had agreed to the trip to Monterey without hesitation. The fact was that he had plunged into work as a means of taking his mind off Dom and the unfolding events in Elko County. For that was where he really wanted to be, neck-deep in the mystery. When Twist told him about Dom's and the pre-psychic demonstration, floating salt and pepper shakers, levitating chairs, nothing short of World War III could have prevented Parker from going to Monterey. And now he was not going to be defeated by an empty house. Wherever the Salcos were, he would find them, and the best place to start would be with the neighbors. Because of the half-acre lots and walls of intervening shrubbery, he could not easily walk next door. Back in the tempo, as he put the car in gear, he glanced at the house again, and at first he thought he saw movement at one of the downstairs windows, a slightly parted drape falling back into place. He sat for a moment staring, then decided the movement had been a trick of fog and shadows. He popped the handbrake and drove around the second half of the circular driveway, out to the street, delighted to be playing spy again. Ernie and Dom parked the Jeep Cherokee at the end of the county road, and the pickup with the tinted windshield halted 200 yards behind them. Perched on its high all-terrain tires with goggle-eyed spotlights on its roof, it looked, Dom thought, like a big insect poised alertly on the downsloping lane, ready to skitter toward a hidey hole if it saw someone with a giant economy-sized can of Raid. The driver did not get out, nor did the passenger, if there was one. "Think there's going to be trouble here?" Dom asked, getting out of the Cherokee and joining Ernie at the side of the road. "If they'd meant trouble, they'd already have made it," Ernie said. His breath steamed in the frigid air. "If they want to tag along and watch, that's all right by me. To hell with them." They got 2 hunting rifles, a Winchester Model 94 carbine, loaded with 32 gauge special cartridges, and a 30 gauge 06 Springfield from the back of the Jeep Cherokee, handling the weapons conspicuously in the hope that the men in the pickup would be encouraged to remain peaceable by the realization that their quarry could fight back. The mountains still rose on the western side of the lane. The forest still clothed those slopes, but the land that fell away to the east had become a broad, treeless field, the northern end of a series of meadows that lay along the valley wall. Although snow had not yet begun to fall, the wind was picking up. Dom was thankful for the winter clothes he had purchased in Reno, but he wished he had an insulated ski suit like Ernie was wearing, and a pair of those rugged lace-up boots instead of the flimsy zippered pair he now wore. Later today, Ginger and Faye would stop at a sporting goods store in Elko with a list of gear needed for tonight's operation, including suitable clothes for Dom and everyone else who did not already have them. At the moment, however, the insistent wind found entrance at Dom's coat collar and at the unelasticized cuffs of his sleeves. Leaving the Cherokee, he and Ernie went over the side of the road down into the sloping meadow, continuing their inspection of the Thunderhill perimeter on foot. The high electrified chain-link fence with the barbed wire overhang led out of the trees farther back. It ceased to parallel the northward course of the county road, turning east and down toward the valley floor. The snow in the meadow was 10 inches deep, but still below the tops of their boots. They slogged 200 yards to a point along the fence from which they could see, in the distance, the enormous steel blast doors set in the side of the valley wall. Dom saw no signs of human or canine guards. The snow on the other side of the fence was not marked by footprints or paw prints, which meant no one walked the perimeter on a regular schedule. "A place like this, they're not going to be sloppy," Ernie said. "So if there aren't any foot patrols, there must be one hell of a lot of electronic security on the other side of this fence." Dom had been glancing toward the top of the meadow, a little worried that the man in the all-terrain truck might be up to something with the Cherokee. This time, when he looked back, he saw a man in dark clothes, starkly silhouetted against the snow. The guy wasn't around the Cherokee and seemed to have no interest in it, but he had come down from the edge of the county road, descending a few yards into the inclined meadow. He was standing up there, unmoving, maybe 180 yards above Dom and Ernie, watching them. Ernie noticed the observer, too. He tucked his Winchester under his right arm and lifted the binoculars he had been carrying on a strap around his neck. "He's Army. At least that looks like a regulation Army greatcoat he's wearing. Just watching us." "You'd think they'd be more discreet." "Can't follow anyone discreetly, not in these wide open spaces. Might as well be forthright. Besides, he wants us to see what he's carrying, so we'll know our rifles don't worry him." "Well, what do you mean?" Dom asked. "What's he carrying?" "A Belgian FN submachine gun. Damn fine weapon. It can fire up to 600 rounds a minute." If Father Wykazik had watched television news, he would have heard about Calvin Sharkle last night, for the man had been a hot story for 24 hours. However, he'd stopped watching TV news years ago, for he decided that its relentless simplification of every story into stark, Black and White Issues was intellectually corrupt, and that its gleeful concentration on violence, sex, gloom, and despair was morally repellent. He also might have read about the tragedy on O'Bannon Lane on the front pages of this morning's Tribune and Sun-Times, but he had left the rectory in such a hurry that he had no time for newspapers. Now he pieced the story together from information provided by those in the crowd behind the police barricades. For months, Cal Sharkle had been acting odd. Ordinarily cheerful and pleasant, a bachelor who lived alone and was well liked by everyone on O'Bannon Lane, he'd become a brooder, dour, and even grim. He told neighbors he had, quote, a bad feeling about things, unquote, and believed something, quote, important and terrible is going to happen, end quote. He read survivalist books and magazines and talked about Armageddon, and he was plagued by vivid nightmares. December 1st, he quit trucking, sold his rig, and told neighbors and relatives the end was imminent. He wanted to sell his house, buy remote property in the mountains, and build a retreat like those he had seen in the survivalist magazines. But there isn't time, he told his sister, Nan Gilchrist. So I'll just prepare this house for a siege. He didn't know what was going to happen, did not understand the source of his own fear, though he said he was not concerned about nuclear war, Russian invasion, economic collapse, or anything else that alarmed most survivalists. I don't know what, but something strange and horrible is going to happen, he told his sister. Mrs. Gilchrist made him see a doctor who found him fit, suffering only from job-related stress. But after Christmas, Calvin's previously garrulous nature gave way to a closed-mouth suspicion. During the first week of January, he had his phone disconnected, cryptically explaining, who knows how they'll get at us when they come. Maybe they can do it over the phone. He was unable or unwilling to identify they. No one considered Cal really dangerous. He had been a peaceful, kind-hearted man all his life. In spite of his new eccentric behavior, there was no reason to think he would turn violent. Then, yesterday morning at 8:30, Cal visited the Wilkersons, the family across the street, with whom he had once been close, but from whom he had recently kept his distance. Edward Wilkerson told reporters that Cal said, "Listen, I can't be selfish about this. I'm all prepared, and here you are defenseless. So when they come for us, Ed, it'll be okay if you and your family hide out at my place." When Wilkerson asked who they were, Cal said, "Well, I don't know what they'll look like or what they'll call themselves, but they're going to do something bad to us, maybe turn us into zombies." Cal Sharkle assured Wilkerson that he had plenty of guns and ammunition in his house and had taken steps to make a fortress of the place. Alarmed by talk of weapons and shootouts, Wilkerson had humored Cal, and as soon as the man left, had called his sister. Nan Gilchrist had arrived at 10:30 with her husband and had told a worried Wilkerson that she would handle it, that she was sure she could persuade Cal to enter the hospital for observation. But after she and Mr. Gilchrist went into the house, Ed Wilkerson decided they might need some backup, so he and another neighbor, Frank Krelke, went to the Sharkle house to provide what assistance they could. Wilkerson expected Mr. or Mrs. Gilchrist to answer the bell, but Cal himself came to the door. He was distraught, nearly hysterical, and armed with a 20-gauge semi-automatic shotgun. He accused his neighbors of being zombies already. "You've been changed," he shouted at Wilkerson and Krelke. "Oh God, I should have seen it. I should have known. When did it happen? When did you stop being human? My God, now you've come to get us all in one swoop." And then with a wail of terror, he opened fire with the shotgun. The first blast took Krelke in the throat at such close range that it decapitated him. Wilkerson ran, was hit in the legs as he reached the end of Sharkle's front walk, fell, rolled, and played dead. a ruse that saved his life. Now Crackley was in the morgue and Wilkerson was in the hospital in good enough condition to talk to reporters. And Father Wachacek was at the entrance to O'Bannon Lane, where a young man in the crowd behind the police line was eager to fill in the last of it for him. The man's name was Roger Hasterwick, a temporarily unemployed beverage concoctionist, which Stefan suspected was an out-of-work bartender. He had a disturbing gleam in his eyes that might have been a sign of intoxication, drug use, lack of sleep, psychopathy, or all four. But his information was detailed and apparently accurate. So, the cops close the block, evacuate the people out their houses. Then they try to talk with the shark, but he don't have a phone, and when they use a bullhorn, he won't answer them. The cops figure his sister and brother-in-law are in there alive, hostages, so nobody wants to do nothing rash. Wise, Father Wachacek said bleakly, feeling even colder than the winter day in which he stood. Wise, Roger Hasterwick said impatiently, making it clear he preferred not to be interrupted. So finally, with a half-hour daylight left, they decide they'll send in the SWAT guys to dig him out, maybe save the sister and brother-in-law. So they lob tear gas in there, and the SWAT guys rush the place. But when they get in, they hit trouble. Sharko must have been working on the house for weeks, setting traps. The cops start falling over these thin wires he's strung everywhere. And one gets brained by a deadfall, which don't kill him, but sure does some damage. Then Christ, Sharko opens fire on him, 'cause he's wearing a gas mask, same as they are, and just waiting like a cat. The dude was prepared. So he blows one cop away utterly, and wounds one. Then he heads down into the cellar, pulls the door shut, and nobody can get in after him, 'cause it's not any regular cellar door, but a steel door he's put in special. Not only that, but the outside cellar door around back is steel too. And what he's done is he's put heavy sheet metal shutters over the insides of the cellar windows, so it's your typical stalemate, By Stefan's calculations, 2 people were dead, 3 wounded. Hasterwick said, so the cops, they pulled in their horns real fast and figured to wait him out through the night. This morning, Sharko's shark slides open one of them sheet metal shutters on a basement window, and he shouts a bunch of stuff, really crazy stuff, and they figure something more is gonna go down. But then he closes the shutter again, and since then, nothing. I sure hope he does something soon, 'cause it's cold, and I'm beginning to get bored. What did he shout? Stefan asked. Huh? This morning, what crazy stuff did he yell from the basement? Well, what he says? Roger Hasterwick stopped when he realized that a piece of news passing in from the edge of the crowd had electrified everyone. People hurried away from the barricade, some walking fast and some running south on Scott Avenue. Appalled by the prospect of missing new bloodshed, Hasterwick grabbed frantically at a blotchy-faced man in a deerstalker cap, the flaps of which were down, but flopping loose. What is it? What's happening? Trying to pull away from Hasterwick, the man in the deerstalker cap said, Guy down here has a van with his own police band radio. He's tuned in on the cops, the SWAT team. They're getting ready to wipe that fucking Sharko off the map. He wrenched loose of Hasterwick and rushed away, and Hasterwick hurried after him. Father Wachacek stared after the departing throng for a moment. Then he glanced around at the 10 or 12 onlookers who had remained, at the officers manning the barricade, past the barricade. More death, murder. He could sense it coming. He should do something to stop it. But he could not think. He was numb with dread. Until now he had seen and been able to see only a positive side to the unfolding mystery. The miraculous cures and other phenomena had engendered only joy and an expectation of divine revelations to come. But now he was seeing the dark side of the mystery, and he was badly shaken by it. Finally, hoping he would not be mistaken for just another ghoul in the bloodthirsty crowd, Stefan hurried after Roger Hasterwick and the others. They had gathered almost a block south of O'Bannon Lane, around a recreational van, a metallic blue Chevrolet with a California beach mural on the side. The owner, a huge and hugely bearded man sitting behind the wheel, had opened both doors and turned up the volume on the police band radio so everyone could hear the cops in action. In a minute or two, the essentials of their attack plan were clear. The SWAT team was already moving into place back into the first floor of Sharko's house. They would use a small, precisely shaped charge of plastic explosives to blow the steel cellar door off its pins. Not enough to send shrapnel cutting through the basement. Simultaneously, another group of officers would blow off the exterior cellar door with a similar, carefully gauged charge. Even as the smoke was clearing, the two groups would storm into the basement and catch Cal Sharko in a pincher attack. That strategy was terribly dangerous for the officers and the hostages, though the authorities had decided that they would be in far greater danger if action was delayed any further. Listening to the radio-relayed voices crackle in the cold January air, Father Wykasik suddenly knew he must stop the attack. If it was carried out, the slaughter would be worse than anyone imagined. He had to be allowed to go past the barricade to the house and talk to Cal Sharko. Now, right away. Now. He turned from the Chevy van and raced back toward the entrance to O'Bannon Lane a block away. He was not sure what he would say to Sharko to get through his paranoia. Perhaps you are not alone, Calvin. He'd think of something. His abrupt departure from the van apparently gave the crowd the idea that he had heard or seen something happening up at the barricade. He was less than halfway back to the entrance to O'Bannon Lane when younger and fleeter onlookers began to pass him, shouting excitedly, plunging off the sidewalk and out into the street, bringing a complete halt to the already crawling traffic on Scott Avenue. Brakes barked, horns blew. There was the thud of one bumper hitting another. Stefan was jostled by runners and struck so hard that he fell to his hands and knees on the pavement. No one stopped to help him. Stefan got up and ran on. The air seemed to have thickened with animal madness and bloodlust. Stefan was horrified of the behavior of his fellow man, and his heart was pounding, and he thought, this is what it might be like in hell, running forever in the midst of a frantic and gibbering mob. By the time Stefan reached the police blockade, more than half the frenzied crowd had returned ahead of him. They were jammed against the sawhorses and police cars, craning to see into the forbidden block of O'Bannon Lane. He pushed in among them, desperate to get to the head of the mob so he could speak to the police. He was pushed, shoved, but he shoved back, telling them he was a priest. But no one was listening, and he felt his fedora knocked off his head, but he persisted, and then at last he was through the front of the surging multitudes. The policemen angrily ordered the mob to move back, threatened arrest, drew batons, lowered the visors on their riot helmets. Father Wykasik was prepared to lie, to tell the police anything that might get them to postpone the imminent attack on the house. Tell them he was not just a priest, but Sharko's own priest, that he knew what was wrong, knew how to get Sharko to surrender. Of course, he didn't really know how to obtain Sharko's surrender, but if he could buy time and talk to Sharko, he might think of something. He caught the attention of an officer who ordered him to step back. He identified himself as a priest. The cop wasn't listening, so Stefan tore open his topcoat and pulled off his white scarf to reveal his Roman collar. I'm a priest! But the crowd surged forward, pushing Stefan against the sawhorse, and the barrier fell over, and the cop shoved back angrily, in no mood to listen. An instant later, two small explosions shook the air, one a split second after the other, low and flat, but hard. The 100 voices of the crowd gasped as one, and everybody froze. for they knew what they had heard, the SWAT team blowing the steel doors off the cellar. A third explosion followed the first two, an immense and devastating blast that shook the pavement, that hurt the ears, that vibrated in bones and teeth, that shot slabs and splinters of Sharko's house into the wintry sky, that seemed to shatter the day itself and cast it down in a billion broken pieces. Again, with a single voice, the crowd cried out. Instead of pressing toward the blockade this time, they scrambled back in fear, suddenly realizing that death could be not just an interesting spectator sport, but a participatory activity. "He had a bomb," one of the barricade cops said. My God, Sharko had a bomb in there." He turned to the emergency medical van in which two paramedics were waiting, and he shouted, "Go, go!" The red beacons flashed atop the paramedics' wagon. It pulled out of the barricades, speeding toward the middle of the block. Shaking with horror, Father Wyckoff tried to follow on foot, but one of the cops grabbed him and said, "Hey, get the hell back there. I'm a priest. Someone may need comforting last rites. Father, I wouldn't care if you were the Pope himself. We don't know for sure that Sharko's dead." Numbly, Father Wyckoff obeyed, though the tremendous power of the explosion left no doubt in his mind that Cal Sharko was dead. Sharko and his sister, and his brother-in-law, and most members of the SWAT team. How many altogether? Maybe 5, 6, 10? Moving aimlessly back through the crowd, absent-mindedly tucking his scarf in place and buttoning his coat, partially in a state of shock, murmuring a paternoster, he saw Roger Hasterwick, the unemployed bartender with the queerly gleaming eyes. He put a hand on Hasterwick's shoulder and said, "What did he shout to the police this morning?" Hasterwick blinked. "Huh? What?" "Before we got separated, you told me Calvin Sharko slid open the metal shutter on one of the cellar windows and shouted a lot of weird stuff this morning, and you thought something was going to happen, but then nothing did. What exactly did he say?" Hasterwick's face brightened with the memory. "Oh, yeah. It was real weird, see, straight out crazy stuff." He scrunched up his face, striving to recall the madman's exact words. When he had them, he grinned, rolled his mouth as if savoring the revelation, then repeated Sharko's ravings for Stefan's enjoyment. Stefan not only failed to enjoy the performance, but second by dreadful second, he became increasingly convinced that Calvin Sharko had not been insane. Confused, yes. Baffled and afraid because of the tremendous stress generated by his brainwashing and by the collapse of his memory blocks. Badly confused, but not insane. Roger Hasterwick and everyone else thought Sharko shouted accusations and declarations and imprecations flung at the world through the shielded window of a jerry-built fortress were obviously the lunatic fantasies of a demented mind, but Father Wyckoff had an advantage over everyone else. He saw Sharko's statements in the context of events at the Tranquility Motel, in the context of miracle cures and telekinetic phenomena, and he wondered if there might be some truth in the claims and accusations that the poor, frightened man had shouted through the basement window. And wondering, he felt the fine hairs rise on the back of his neck. He shivered. Seeing that reaction, Hasterwick said, "Hey, ain't no point taking it seriously, for Christ's sake. You don't think what he said was true?" "Well, the guy was a nut. He blowed himself up, didn't he?" Father Wyckoff ran north along Scott Avenue to the parish car. Even before he had arrived in Evanston and discovered the unfolding tragedy at Calvin Sharko's house, Stefan Wyckoff had half expected to be on a flight to Nevada before the day was through. The events at the Mendoza's apartment and at the Halborg's place had set a fire of wonder and curiosity burning in him, and the blaze would not be quenched unless he plunged into the activities of the trouble group in Elko County. Now, because of what he had just learned from Hasterwick, the urge to go to Nevada had become a burning need. If only half of what Sharkle had shouted through the basement window is true, Stefan had to go to Nevada, not only to witness the miracle, but to do what he could to protect those who had gathered at the Tranquility. All his life he had been a rescuer of troubled priests, a shepherd bringing lost souls back into the fold. This time, however, he might be called upon to save minds and lives as well. The threat of which Calvin Sharkle had spoken was one that might put body and brain in as much jeopardy as the spirit. He slipped the car in gear again and he drove out of Evanston. He decided not to return to the rectory to pack. There was no time. He would head straight to O'Hare International Airport and take the first available seat on the first available flight west. Dear God, he thought, what have you sent us? Is it the greatest gift for which we could have asked, or a plague to make all biblical plagues pale by comparison? Father Stefan Wyckowick put the pedal to the metal and drove south and then west toward O'Hare like a bat out of hell. Ginger and Faye spent the larger part of the morning with Elroy and Nancy Jamison under the pretense that Ginger, supposedly the daughter of an old friend of Faye's, was moving west for unspecified health reasons and was interested in learning about Elko County. The Jamisons were local history buffs, eager to talk about the county, especially about the beauty of the Lamoille Valley. Actually, indirectly and directly, Ginger and Faye were seeking indications that Elroy and Nancy were suffering from the effects of collapsing memory blocks. They found none. The Jamisons were happy, untroubled. Their brainwashing had been as successful as Faye's. Their false memories were firmly rooted. Bringing them into the Tranquility family would put them in jeopardy while serving no great purpose. In the motel van, as they pulled away from the Jamison house, with Elroy and Nancy waving from the front porch, Ginger said, "Good people, really nice people." "Yes," Faye said, "reliable. Wish they were standing beside us in this thing. On the other hand, I'm happy they're well out of it." Both women were quiet then, and Ginger figured Faye's thoughts were the same as her own. They were wondering if the government car was still parked along the county road near the entrance to the Jamisons' place, and if the men in it would still be content merely to follow them. Ernie and Dom had armed themselves for their expedition into the mountains around Thunderhill Depository. However, considering the unprovocative nature of Faye's and Ginger's errands, no one had thought that they might be in special danger too. Ginger, like many attractive women living alone in a city, knew how to use a handgun, and Faye, a good Marine wife, was something of an expert, but their knowledge and expertise was of no use when they were not armed. Having driven only a quarter-mile along the Jamisons' half-mile driveway, Faye stopped the van in one of the deepest pools of shadows cast by the overhanging pinions. "I'm probably being melodramatic," she said. She slipped open a few buttons on her coat and reached under her sweater. "And these won't be much good if they point guns at our heads." Grimacing, she withdrew 2 steak knives and put them on the seat between her and Ginger. Surprised, Ginger said, "Where'd you get these?" This is why I insisted on drying the breakfast dishes while Nancy washed them. Putting away the silverware, I swiped these. Didn't want to ask straight out for a weapon. That would have meant bringing Nancy and Elroy into it, which it was clear we weren't going to have to do. I can return them later when this is over. She picked up one of the knives. The ends nicely pointed, the blades sharp and serrated. Like I said, not much help if they got a gun at your head, but if they were to run us off the road and try to force us into their car, you keep the knife a secret until you get your opening, then stab the bastard. "Got it," Ginger said. She grinned and shook her head. Someday I hope you'll get a chance to meet Rita Hanneby, your friend in Boston. Yes, you and Rita are a lot alike, I think. Me and a high society lady, Faye said doubtfully. Can't imagine what we'd have in common. Well, for one thing, you both have such equanimity, such serenity, regardless of what's happening. Putting the knife back on the seat, Faye said, when you're a service wife, you either learn to go with the flow or you go crazy. And both you and Rita look so feminine, soft and dependent on the outside, but inside, each of you is, in your own way, tough as nails. Faye smiled. Honey, you got a bit of that yourself. They drove the last quarter mile of the pinyon-shaded driveway, out of the shadows and into the midday gloom of the pending storm. The brown-green stripped-down government car was still parked along the county road. 2 men were in it. They looked impassively at Ginger. Impulsively, she waved at them. They did not wave back. Faye drove down toward the floor of the Lamoille Valley. The car followed. Miles Bennell slumped in the big chair behind his gray metal desk and looked bored, and Miles Bennell ambled around his office while answering questions in a tone of voice that was sometimes indifferent and sometimes amusedly ironic, but Miles Bennell never fidgeted, groveled, looked frightened, or became angry, as almost any other man would have done in the same situation. Colonel Leland Falkirk hated him. Sitting at a scarred table in one corner of the room, Leland worked slowly through a stack of personnel files, one for each of the civilian scientists who were conducting studies and experiments in the cavern with the immense wooden doors where the secret of July 6 was contained. He was hoping to narrow the field of possible traitors by determining which men and women could have been in New York City during the time the 2 notes and Polaroid snapshots had been mailed to Dominic Corvasis in Laguna Beach. He had told Thunderhill's military security staff to do this work on Sunday, and they professed to have completed the inquiries and to have found nothing to pinpoint the leak. But in light of the screw-ups in their investigation thus far, including 2 sabotaged lie detectors, he no longer trusted them any more than he trusted Bennell or the other scientists. He had to do it himself. But right away, Leland ran into problems. For one thing, during the past 18 months, too damn many civilians had been brought into the conspiracy. 37 men and women, representing a broad spectrum of scientific disciplines, had possessed both high security clearances and specialized knowledge essential to the research program Bennell had devised. 38 civilians counting Bennell. It was a miracle that 38 eggheads, utterly lacking in military discipline, could have kept any secret so long, let alone this one. Worse, only Bennell and 7 others were engaged in the research full-time, to the exclusion of all other professional pursuits, and to the extent that they actually lived in Thunder Hill. The other 30 had families and university positions. They could not leave for long periods of time, so they came and went as their schedules permitted, sometimes staying a few days, maybe a few weeks, rarely as long as a few months. Therefore, it would be a long and arduous job to investigate each and determine if and when he or she had been in New York. Worse still, of the 8 members of the full-time investigatory team, 3 had been in New York in December, including Dr. Miles Bennell himself. In short, the list of suspects currently numbered at least 33 among the scientific research staff alone. Leland was also suspicious of the entire depository security staff, though Major Fugata and Lieutenant Helms, the head of security, and his right-hand man were supposedly the only security personnel who knew what was happening in the Forbidden Cavern. On Sunday, Soon after, Fugata began questioning the full-time research staff and those part-time researchers currently in residence. He discovered that the polygraph was damaged and could not produce reliable results. Yesterday, when a new machine was sent up from Schenkfield, it also proved defective. Fugata said that the second machine was already damaged when it arrived from Schenkfield, but that was bullshit. Someone involved in the project had seen reports that the witnesses' memory blocks were breaking down. Deciding to exploit that opportunity, he egged some of them along with cryptic notes and Polaroids stolen from the files. The bastard had nearly gotten away with it, and now that the heat was coming down on him, he had sabotaged the lie detectors. Pausing in his perusal of the personnel files, Leland looked at Miles Bennell, who was standing in the small window. "Doctor, give me the benefit of your insight into the scientific mind." Turning away from the window, Bennell said, "Certainly, Colonel. Everyone working with you knows about the classified CISG report that was done 7 years ago. They know the terrible consequences that might result if we went public with our discoveries. So, why would any of them be so irresponsible as to undermine project security?" Dr. Bennell assumed a tone of earnest helpfulness, but Leland heard the acid-sharp disdain beneath the surface. "Some disagree with CISG's conclusions. Some think going public with these discoveries wouldn't result in a catastrophe, that the CISG was fundamentally wrong, too elitist in its viewpoint. Well, I believe the CISG was correct. And you, Lieutenant Horner?" Horner was sitting near the door. "I agree with you, Colonel. If the news is broken to the public, they'll have to be prepared slowly over maybe 10 years. And even then..." Leland nodded. To Bennell, he said, "I have a low but realistic opinion of my fellow men, Doctor, and I know how poorly most would cope with the new world that would follow the release of these discoveries. Chaos, political and social upheaval, just like the CISG report said." Bennell shrugged. "You're entitled to your view." But his tone said, "Even if your view is ignorant and arrogant and narrow-minded." Leaning forward in his chair, Leland said, "How about you, Doctor? Do you believe the CISG was right?" Evasively, Bennell said, "I'm not your man, Colonel. I didn't send those notes and Polaroids to Corvasis and the blocks." "Okay, Doctor. Then will you support my effort to have everyone in the project interrogated with the assistance of drugs? Even if we get the polygraph fixed, the answers we obtained will be less reliable than those we'd get with sodium pentothal and certain other substances." Bennell frowned. "Well, there are some who'd object strenuously. These are people of superior intellect, Colonel. Intellectual life is their primary life, and they won't risk subjecting themselves to drugs that might, as a side effect, have even the slightest permanent detrimental effect on their mental function. These drugs don't have that effect. They're safe. They're safe most of the time, maybe, but some of my people will have moral objections to using drugs for any reason, even safe drugs, even for a worthwhile purpose. Doctor, I'm going to push for drug-assisted interrogation of everyone in Thunder Hill, those who know the secret and those who don't. I'm going to demand General Alvarado approve." Alvarado was commanding officer of the Thunder Hill Depository, a pencil-pushing desk jockey who had spent his career on his backside. Leland liked Alvarado no more than he liked Bennell. "If the general approves drug-assisted interrogation, and if any of your people then refuse, I'll come down hard on them, hard enough to break them. That includes you, if you refuse. You understand me?" "Oh, perfectly," Bennell said, still unruffled. Disgusted, the colonel pushed the remaining personnel files aside. This is too damn slow. I need the traitor quickly, not a month from now. We better repair the polygraph. He started to get up, then sat down as if he'd just thought of what he was about to ask, though it had been on his mind since he entered the depository. Doctor, what do you think of this development with Cronin and Corvasis? These miraculous cures and the other bizarre phenomena? What do you make of it? Finally, Benno showed strong, genuine emotion. He unfolded his hands from behind his head and leaned forward in his chair. I'm sure it scares the hell out of you, Colonel, but there could be another less cataclysmic explanation than the one on which you've fixated. Fear is your only reaction. Well, I think it might be the greatest moment in the history of the human race. But whatever the case, we've absolutely got to talk with Cronin and Corvasis, tell them everything, and seek their cooperation to discover exactly how they obtain these wonderful powers. We can't simply eliminate them or put them through another memory wipe without knowing all the answers. If we bring everyone at the Tranquility into this, tell them the secret, and then don't wipe their memories again, the cover-up can't be maintained. Possibly not, Benno said. And if that's the case, then the public will just have to be told. Damn it, Colonel, because of these recent developments, studying Cronin and Corvasis takes precedence over everything else, including the cover-up. Not only studying them, but letting them have a chance to develop whatever strange talents they may have. In fact, when will you take them into custody? This afternoon at the latest. Then we can expect you to bring them to us sometime tonight? Yes, Leland rose from his chair again. He picked up his coat and walked to the office door where Lieutenant Horner was waiting. He paused. Doctor, how will you know if Cronin and Corvasis are changed or not? You think there's no real chance of possession. But if you're wrong, if they're not entirely human anymore, and if they don't want you to know the truth, how could you possibly discover it? Obviously, they could defeat a lie detector or any truth serums we have. That's a puzzler, all right. Miles Benno stood up, jammed his hands into the pockets of his lab coat, and began to pace energetically. My God, it's a real challenge, isn't it? We've been working on the problem ever since we learned about their new powers from you on Sunday. We've been through ups and downs, despair, but now we think we can deal with it. We've devised medical tests, psychological tests, some tricky damn stuff, and we think that all of it taken together will accurately determine whether or not they're infected, whether or not they're human anymore. I think your fears are utterly unfounded. We thought infection, possession, was a danger at first, but it's been more than a year since we learned we were wrong. I think they can be entirely human and still have these powers, are entirely human. I don't agree. My fears are well-founded, and if Corvasis and Cronin and the others have changed, and if you believe you can get the truth out of them, you're kidding yourself. If they've changed, they're so superior to you that deceiving you would be child's play. You haven't even heard and something else, Doctor. Something you haven't thought of, but which I must consider. Maybe this will help you appreciate my position, with which you've thus far had little sympathy. Don't you realize I have to be suspicious and scared of more than just the people at the Tranquility? Ever since we've learned of these recent developments, these paranormal powers, I've been scared of you as well. But I was thunderstruck. Me? You've been working here with it, Doctor. You're in the cavern nearly every day, doing lab work every day, probing, testing every damn day for 18 months, with only 3 brief vacations. If Corvasis and Cronin were changed in a few hours of contact, why shouldn't I suspect you've been changed after 18 months? For a moment, Benel was too shocked to speak. Then he said, but this isn't the same at all. My studies here were after the fact. I'm essentially a fire marshal, a guy who came in after the blaze to sift through the ashes and figure out what happened. The potential for possession or infection, if it ever existed, was at the beginning in the first hours, not later. How can I be sure of that? Leland asked, staring at him coldly. But under these lab conditions with safety precautions, we're dealing with the unknown, Doctor. We can't foresee every problem that might arise. That's the very nature of the unknown. And you can't take precautions against something you can't foresee. Benel shook his head violently in denial of the very possibility. No, oh no. If you think I'm exaggerating my concern just to irritate you, Leland said, then you might ask yourself why Lieutenant Horner sat in that chair so alertly during our conversation. After all, as you know, he's an expert in polygraphs, and he could have gone and repaired yours while you and I talked. But I didn't want to be in a room with you alone, Dr. Benel. Not alone, no way. Blinking, Benel said, you mean because I might have somehow... Leland nodded. Because if you have been changed, then you might have been able to change me, too, by some process I can't even begin to imagine. Alone, you might have used the opportunity to attack me, infect me, arrange for me to be possessed, pour the human spirit out of me, and pour something else in. Leland shuddered. Hell, I don't know how to put it best, but we both know what I mean. We even wondered if two of us were enough to ensure our safety, Lieutenant Horner said, his voice rumbling through the low-ceiling room and vibrating vaguely in the metal walls. I kept a close eye on you, Doctor. You didn't notice my hand was always near my revolver. But I was too astonished to speak. Leland said, Doctor, you may think I'm a suspicious bastard who's too quick on the trigger, an unregenerate, xenophobic fascist, but I've been put in charge of this not merely to keep the truth from the public, but also to protect them, and it's part of my job to think of the worst and then to act as if it will inevitably happen. Jesus H. Christ, Benel said, you're total, off-the-wall paranoids, both of you. I'd expect you to react that way, Leland told him, whether or not you're still a full-fledged member of the human race. To Horner, he said, let's go, you have a polygraph to repair. Horner went out into the hub, and Leland started after him. Benel said, wait, please. Leland looked back at the pale, black-bearded man. All right, Colonel, okay. Maybe I can see why you've got to be suspicious, why it's just part of your job. It's crazy nonetheless. There's no chance that I or any of my people could have been inhabited by something else. No chance. But if you were ready to kill me, if I aroused your suspicion, would you also kill everyone working under me if you decided they'd all been taken over? Without hesitation, Leland said bluntly. But if I and my people could have been changed, if that much was possible, and it isn't possible, then don't you realize that the entire staff in Thunder Hill could have been changed too? Not just the people who know what's in that cavern, but everyone, military as well as civilian, all the way up to and including General Alvarado. Well, sure, Leland said, I realize that. And you'd be willing to kill everyone in the facility? Yes. Jesus. If you've decided to split, Leland said, you can forget about leaving for the duration. 18 months ago, looking ahead to this possibility, I secretly had a special program entered into Vigilant, the security system. At my direction, Vigilant can institute a new policy that makes it impossible for anyone to leave Thunder Hill without a special code. I'm the only one with the code, of course. Manel's posture was the essence of indignation and righteous outrage. You mean you'd imprison us out of some misguided... He fell silent as the truth hit him. Then, my God, you wouldn't have told me this if you hadn't already activated Vigilant's new program. That's right, Leland said. When I came in, I identified myself with my left hand on the ID plate instead of my right. That was the signal to Vigilant to institute the new order. No one but Lieutenant Horner and I can get out of Thunder Hill until I decide it's safe. Leland Falkirk left the office, walked out into the hub, as pleased with himself as was possible under these disturbing conditions. It had taken 18 months, but he had at last shattered Miles Bennell's infuriating composure. If he had chosen to make one more revelation, he could have brought the scientist all the way to his knees. But there was one secret the colonel had to keep to himself. He had already devised a plan to kill everyone and everything in Thunder Hill in the event that he decided they were infected and only masquerading as human. He had the means to reduce the installation to molten slag and stop the plague right here. The hitch was that he would have to kill himself along with everyone else, but he was prepared for that sacrifice. After sleeping only 5.5 hours, Georgia showered, dressed, and went to the box apartment, where she found Marcy sitting at the kitchen table with Jack Twist. She stopped at the end of the living room, just outside the kitchen doorway, and watched them for a moment, while they remained unaware they were being observed. Last night at 4:40 a.m., after Georgia and Jack and Brendan had rendezvoused at the mini-mart with the second team of Outriders and had returned from Elko, Jack had slept on the floor in the box living room, so Marcy would not be alone. In the morning, after Faye and Ernie had gone off on their respective tasks, Georgia had wanted to move the girl to their own room, but Jack had insisted that he did not mind doing a little babysitting after Marcy woke. Look, he said, she's sleeping with Faye and Ernie in their bed. If we try to move her now, we'll wake all of them, and everyone needs whatever sleep he can get tonight, Georgia said. But Marcy's been sleeping for hours, so she'll wake up and around before you are. So she'll be up and around before you are in the morning. She'll wake you. And he said, better me than you. Really, I don't need much sleep, never have. And she said, you're a nice guy, Jack Twist. He said self-mockingly, oh, I'm a saint. And she said with great seriousness, you may be the nicest guy I've ever met. She had firmly settled on that opinion during the hours they had cruised through the night-clad streets of Elko in his Cherokee. He was smart, witty, perceptive, gentle, and the best listener she'd ever encountered. At 1:30 in the morning, Brendan pleaded exhaustion and curled up in the back of the Cherokee, instantly falling asleep. Georgia, dismayed that the priest had come with them, had not really understood her dismay until Father Cronin went to sleep. Then she realized that her feelings had nothing to do with the priest, but resulted from her desire to have Jack Twist to herself. With Brendan out of the way, she got what she unconsciously wanted, and she fell entirely under Jack's spell, telling him more about herself than she had told anyone since her all-time closest friend had moved away when they were both 16. In almost 7 years of marriage, she had never had a conversation with Alan that was half as profound as that she had with Jack Twist, a man she'd known less than 12 hours. Now, as she stood just outside the kitchen doorway in the box apartment and watched Jack with Marcy, Georgia saw another good side of him. He could talk comfortably with the child without the slightest note of condescension or boredom, something few adults could manage. He joked with Marcy. Questioned her about her favorite songs, foods, and movies, helped her color one of the last untinted moons in her album. But Marcy was in a deeper and even more frightening trance than she had been yesterday. She did not answer Jack. She rewarded his attention with nothing more than an occasional blank or puzzled look. But he was not discouraged. Georgia realized that he had spent 8 years talking to a comatose wife who had never responded, so he would not lose patience with Marcy anytime soon. Georgia stood in the shadows just beyond the doorway for several minutes unannounced, torn between the pleasure of watching Jack be Jack and the agony of watching her daughter descend even farther into a state increasingly similar to some of the behavior of an autistic child. "Good morning," Jack said, looking up from the Book of Red Moons, spotting Georgia. "Sleep well? How long have you been standing there?" "Not long," she said, entering the kitchen. "Marcy, say good morning to your mother," Jack told the girl. But Marcy did not look up from the moon that she was coloring. Georgia met Jack's eyes and saw sympathy and concern in them. She said, "Well, it's not really morning anymore, almost noon." She went to Marcy, put a hand under her chin, lifted her head. The child's gaze focused on her mother's eyes, but only for a moment, then turned inward. It was a terrible and empty look. When Georgia let go, Marcy turned immediately to the image of the moon before her and began to scrub hard at the paper with her last red crayon. Jack pushed his chair back, got up, and went to the refrigerator. "Hungry, Georgia?" "I'm starved. Marcy ate earlier, but I've been waiting breakfast on you." He pulled open the refrigerator door. "Eggs and bacon and toast? Or I could whip up an omelet with some cheese, herbs, just a touch of onion, a few slivers of green peppers." "You cook too," Georgia said. "I'll never win any prizes," he said, "but it's usually edible. And at least half the time you can even tell what it is when I put it on your plate." He pulled open the freezer door. "They have frozen waffles. I could toast a few of those to go along with the omelet." "Whatever you're having." She was unable to look away from Marcy, and as she watched her stricken daughter, her appetite faded. Jack loaded his arms with a carton of milk, another of eggs, a package of cheese, a green pepper, and a small onion, and carried the fixings to the cutting board beside the sink. When Jack began cracking eggs into a bowl, Georgia joined him at the counter. Although she did not think Marcy would hear her, even if she shouted, she spoke sotto voce to Jack. "Did she really eat breakfast?" He whispered to her, "Sure, some cereal, a piece of toast with jelly and peanut butter. I had to help her a little, that's all." Georgia tried not to think about what Dom had told her of Zebediah Lomack, or about how Lomack tied in with what had happened to Alan. But if two grown men had been unable to cope with the sick obsessions that had evolved from what they'd seen on July 6th and from the subsequent brainwashing, what chance did Marcy have of coping, living? Hey, Jack said softly. "Don't cry, Georgia. Crying won't help anything." He took her in his arms. "She'll be all right, I promise you. Listen, just this morning, the others were saying they had a terrific night last night. No dreams for a change. And Dom didn't sleepwalk. And Ernie wasn't half as afraid of the dark as usual. Know why? Because just being here, pulling together like a family, it's already making the memory blocks crumble, relieving the pressure. All right, yes, Marcy's a bit worse this morning, but that doesn't mean it's all downhill for her. She'll improve. I know she will." Georgia had not expected the embrace, but she welcomed it. God, how she welcomed it. She leaned against him and allowed herself to be held, and instead of feeling weak and foolish, she felt a new strength flowing into her. She was tall for a woman, and he was not tall for a man, so they were almost the same height, yet she had the atavistic feeling of being protected, guarded. She was reminded of what she'd been thinking yesterday on the flight north from Las Vegas. Human beings were not meant for solitude, lonely struggles. The very essence of the species was its need to give and receive friendship, affection, love. Right now she needed to receive, and Jack needed to give, and the confluence of their needs gave new purpose and determination to both of them. An omelet with cheese, herbs, a little bit of chopped onion, and slivers of green pepper, he said softly, his lips against her ear, as if sensing that she had regained her footing and was ready to go on. Does that sound all right? Sounds delicious, she said, reluctantly letting go of him. And one other ingredient, he said. I warned you I wouldn't win any cooking prizes. I always get one little chip of eggshell in every omelet, no matter how careful I am. Oh, that's the secret of a good omelet, she said. One bit of eggshell for texture. The finest restaurants make omelets that way. Yeah? Do they also have one bone in every fish? And a bit of hoof in every order of beef bourguignon, she said. One antler in every chocolate mousse, and one shoemaker's nail in every apple cobbler. One old maid in every apple pandowdy. My gosh, I hate puns. Me too, he said. Truce? Truce. I'll grate the cheddar for the omelet. Together they made breakfast. At the kitchen table, Marcy colored moons, and murmured that one word in monotonous, mesmeric, rhythmic chains. In Monterey, California, Parker Fane had almost fallen into the lair of a trapdoor spider. He counted himself fortunate to have gotten out alive. A trapdoor spider, that was how he thought of the Salco's neighbor, a woman named Essie Craw. The trapdoor spider constructed a tubular nest in the ground and fixed a cleverly concealed hinge lid at the top. When other hapless insects, innocent and unsuspecting, crossed the perfectly camouflaged lid, it opened and dropped them down to the rapacious arachnoid beast below. Essie Craw's tubular nest was a lovely large Spanish home, far more suited to the California coast than the Salco's southern colonial manse, with graceful arches and leaded glass windows and flowers blooming in large terracotta pots on the portico. One look at the place and Parker was prepared to encounter charming and exquisitely gracious people. But when Essie Craw answered the door, he knew he was in deep trouble. When she discovered that he was seeking information about the Salcos, she virtually seized him by his sleeve and dragged him inside and slammed the lid of her tubular nest behind him. For those who sought information often had information to give in return, and Essie Craw fed on gossip as surely as the trapdoor spider fed on careless beetles, centipedes, and pillbugs. Essie did not look like a spider, but rather like a bird. Not a scrawny, thin-necked, meager-breasted sparrow, more like a well-fed seagull. She had a quick bird-like walk, and she held her head slightly to the side in the manner of a bird, and she had beady little avian eyes. After leading him to a seat in the living room, she offered coffee, but he declined, and she insisted, but he protested that he did not want to be a bother. She brought coffee anyway, plus butter cookies, which she produced with such alacrity that he suspected she was as perpetually prepared for dropping guests as was the trapdoor spider. Essie was disappointed to hear that Parker knew nothing about the Salco family and had no gossip. But since he was not their friend either, he offered a fresh pair of ears for her observations, tales, slanders, and mean-spirited suppositions. He did not even have to ask questions in order to learn more than he wanted to know. Donna Sacco, Gerald's wife, was, as he said, a brassy sort, too blonde, too flashy, phony sweet. Donna was so thin, she was surely a problem drinker who survived on a liquid diet, or maybe she was anorexic. Gerald was Donna's second husband, and although they had been married 18 years, Essie did not think it would last. Essie made the 16-year-old twin girls sound so wild, so unrestrained, so nubile and licentious that Parker pictured packs of young men sniffing around the Sacco house like dogs seeking bitches in heat. Gerald Sacco owned 3 thriving shops, an antique store, 2 art galleries in nearby Carmel, though Essie could not understand how any of these enterprises showed a profit when Sacco was a hard-drinking libertine and a thick-headed boob with no business sense. Parker drank only 2 sips of his coffee and didn't even nibble at the butter cookies because Essie Craw's enthusiasm for malicious gossip went beyond the limits of ordinary behavior into a realm of weirdness that made him uncomfortable and unwilling to turn his back on her or consume much of what she provided. But he learned a few useful things as well. The Saccos had taken an impromptu vacation, 1 week in the wine country, Napa and Sonoma, and had been so desperate to escape the pressures of their various enterprises that they had not wanted to reveal the name of the hotel where they could be reached, lest they get back to the very business associates from whom they needed a rest. He called me Sunday to tell me they were off and wouldn't be back until Monday the 20th, as he said. Asked me to keep a watch over the place, as usual. They're terrible gadabouts, and it's such a bother to be expected to look out for burglars, and God knows what. I have my own life to live, which of course concerns them not at all. You didn't speak with any of them face to face? I guess they were in a hurry to be off. Did you see them leave? No, though I looked out a couple of times, but I must have missed them. The twins went with them? Parker asked. Isn't school in? It's a progressive school, too progressive, I say, and travel is thought to be as broadening as classroom work. Did you ever hear such... How did Mr. Sacco sound when you spoke with him on the phone? Impatiently, Essie said, well, he sounded like he always sounds. What do you mean? Not at all strained, nervous? She pursed her tight little mouth, cocked her head, and her bird-bright eyes glittered at the prospect of potential scandal. Well, now that you mention it, he was a bit odd. Stumbled over his words a few times, but until now I didn't realize he'd probably been drinking. Do you think that he's had to go off to some clinic to dry out, or Parker had heard enough? He rose to leave, but Essie got between him and the doorway, trying to delay him by making him feel guilty that he had not finished his coffee or even tasted a cookie. She suggested tea instead of coffee, some strudel, or perhaps an almond croissant. By dint of the same indomitable will that had made him a great painter, he managed to get to the front door, through it, and onto the portico. She followed him all the way to the rental car in her driveway. The little vomit-green Tempo looked, for that one moment, as beautiful as a Rolls-Royce, for it offered escape from Essie Craw. As he sped away, he quoted Coleridge aloud, an apt passage. Like one that on a lonesome road doth walk in fear and dread, and having once turned round walks on, and turns no more his head, because he knows a frightful fiend doth close behind him tread. He drove around for half an hour, working up the courage to do what must be done. Finally, upon his return to the Sacco house, he parked boldly at the head of the circular driveway. in the shadows of the massive pines. He went to the front door again, insistently pressed the bell for 3 minutes. If anyone was home and merely unwilling to see visitors, he would have answered that unrelenting ring out of sheer desperation, but no one responded. Parker walked along the veranda, studying the front windows, being nonchalant, acting as if he belonged there, though the property was so shrouded by trees and lush landscaping that he could not be spotted easily from the street or from Essie Craw's windows. The drapes were shut, preventing a glimpse of the interior. He expected to see the telltale electricity conducting tape of an alarm system on the glass, but there was no tape and no other indication of electronic security. He stepped off the end of the veranda and went around the western side of the house, where the morning sun had not shrunk the long, deep shadows of the pines. He tried 2 windows there. They were locked. In back of the house were more shrubs, flowers, and a large brick patio with a lattice cover, outdoor wet bar, expensive lawn furniture. He used his coat-protected elbow to smash in a small pane on one of the French doors. He unlocked the door and went inside, pushing through the drapes into a tiled-floored family room. He stood very still, listening. The house was silent. It would have been uncomfortably dark if the family room had not opened onto a breakfast area, and the breakfast area onto the kitchen, where light entered through the glass in that uncurtained door to the patio. Parker moved past a fireplace, billiards table, and froze when he spotted the motion detection alarm unit on the wall. He recognized it from when he had investigated security systems for his Laguna house. He was about to flee when he recalled that a small red light should have been visible on the unit if it was in operation. The bulb was there, but dark. Apparently the system had not been activated when the Salkos had left. The kitchen was roomy with the best appliances. Beyond that was the serving pantry, then the dining room. The light from the kitchen did not reach that far, so he decided to risk turning on lights as he went. In the living room, he stood very still again, listening. Nothing. The silence was deep and heavy, as in a tomb. When Brendan Cronin entered the Block's kitchen after rising late and taking a long hot shower, he found little Marcy coloring moons and murmuring eerily to herself. He thought of how he had mended Emmeline Halborg with his hands, and he wondered if he could cure Marcy's psychological obsession by the application of that same psychic power, but he dared not try, not until he learned to control his wild talent, for he might do irreparable harm to the girl's mind. Jack and Georgia were finishing omelets and toast, and they greeted him warmly. Georgia wanted to make breakfast for Brendan too, but he declined. He only wanted a cup of coffee, black and strong. As Jack ate, he examined 4 handguns that were lying on the table beside his plate. 2 of them were Ernie's. Jack had bought the other 2 with him from the east. Neither Brendan nor anyone else referred to the firearms, for they knew their enemy might be listening right now. No point revealing the size of their arsenal. The guns made Brendan nervous. Maybe because he had a prescient feeling that the weapons would be used repeatedly before day's end. His characteristic optimism had left him, largely because he had not dreamed last night. He'd had his first uninterrupted sleep in weeks, but for him that was no improvement. Unlike the others, Brendan had been having a good dream every night, and it had given him hope. Now the dream was gone, and the loss made him edgy. "I thought it would be snowing by now," he said, as he sat down at the table with a cup of coffee. "Soon," Jack said. The sky looked like a great slab of dark gray granite. Ned and Sandy Sarver, serving as the second team of outriders, had driven into Elko to rendezvous with Jack, Georgia, and Brendan at the Arco Mini Mart at 4 in the morning. then had cruised around town until 7:30, by which time some of those back at the Tranquility would have set out on their tasks for the day. They returned to the motel at 8 o'clock, ate a quick breakfast, and went back to bed to get a few more hours of rest in order to cope with the busy day ahead. Ned woke after a little more than 2 hours, but he did not get out of bed. He lay in the dimness of the motel room for a while, watching Sandy sleep. The love he felt for her was deep and smooth, and flowing like a great river that could bear them both away to better places and times beyond all the worries of the world. Ned wished he was as good a talker as he was a fixer. Sometimes he worried that he had never been able to tell her exactly how he felt about her, but when he tried to put his sentiments into words, he either became tongue-tied or heard himself expressing his emotions in hopelessly inarticulate sentences and leaden images. It was good to be a fixer with the talent to repair everything from broken toasters to broken cars to broken people. Yet sometimes Ned would have traded all his mending skills for the ability to compose and speak one perfect sentence which would convey his deepest feelings for her. Now, watching her, he realized that she was no longer sleeping. "Playing possum?" he asked. She opened her eyes and smiled. "I was scared, the way you were watching me, that I was going to get eaten alive, so I played possum." "You look good enough to eat, that's for sure." She threw aside the covers and, naked, opened her arms to him. They fell at once into the familiar silken rhythms of love-making at which they had become so sensually adept during the past year of her sexual awakening. In the afterglow, as they lay side by side holding hands, Sandy said, "Oh, Ned, I must be the happiest woman on earth. Since I met you down in Arizona all those years ago, since you took me under your wing, you've made me very happy, Ned. In fact, I'm so crazy happy now that if God struck me dead this minute, I wouldn't complain." "Don't say that," he told her sharply. Rising up on one elbow, leaning over her, looking down at her, he said, "I don't like you saying that. It makes me superstitious. All this trouble we're in, it's possible some of us will die, so I don't want you tempting fate. I don't want you saying things like that." "Ned, you're about the least superstitious man I know." "Yeah, well, I feel different about this. I don't want you saying you're so happy you wouldn't mind dying. Nothing like that. Understand? I don't want you even thinking it." He slipped his arms around her again, pulling her very tightly against him, needing to feel the throb of life within her. He held her so close that after a while he could no longer detect the strong and regular stroking of her heart, which was only because it had become synchronized with and lost in his own beat. In the Salco family's Monterey house, Parker Fane was looking primarily for two things, either of which would fulfill his obligation to Dom. First, he hoped to find something to prove they had actually gone to Napa Sonoma. If he found a brochure for a hotel, he could call and confirm that the Salcos had checked in safely, or if they went to the wine country regularly, perhaps an address book would contain the telephone number of the place where they stayed. But he half expected to find the other thing instead: overturned furniture, bloodstains, or other evidence that the Salcos had been taken against their will. Of course, Dom had only asked him to come talk with these people. He would be appalled to know that Parker had gone to these illegal lengths when the Salcos had been unlocatable. But Parker never did anything by halves, and he was enjoying himself even though his heart had begun to pound and his throat had clutched up a bit. Beyond the living room was a library. Beyond that, a small music room contained a piano, music stands, chairs, 2 clarinet cases, and a ballet exercise bar. Evidently, the twins liked music and dance. Parker found nothing amiss on the first floor, so he slowly climbed the stairs, staying in the runner of plush carpet between oak inlays. The light from the first floor reached just the top step. Above, the second floor hallway was dark. He stopped on the landing. Stillness. His hands were clammy. He did not understand why he was clutching up, maybe instinct. It might be wise to pay attention to his more primitive senses, but if anyone had wanted to ambush him, there had been plenty of places on the first floor ideal for the purpose, yet the rooms had been deserted. He continued upward, and when he reached the second floor hallway, he finally heard something. It was a cross between a beep sound and a blip sound, and it came from rooms on both ends of the hall. For a moment he thought the alarm system was about to go off after all, but an alarm would have been 1,000 times louder than these beep blips. The sounds came in counterpointed rhythmic patterns. He found a switch at the head of the stairs and snapped down the overhead lights in the hall. Standing motionless once more, he listened for noises other than the curious beep blips. He heard none. There is something familiar about the sound, but it eluded him. His curiosity was greater than his fear. He had always been compelled by a chronic curiosity, with frequent acute attacks of same. And if he had not allowed it to drive him in the past, he'd never have become a successful painter. Curiosity was the heart of creativity. Therefore, he looked both ways along the hall, then turned right and walked cautiously toward one source of the beep blips. At the end of the hallway, there were 2 distinct sets of beeping sounds, each with a slightly different rhythm, both coming from a dark room where the door was 3/4 shut. Poised to flee, he pushed the door all the way open. Nothing leaped at him out of the darkness. The beeping became louder, but only because the door was out of the way now. He saw that the room was not entirely dark. On the far wall, thin ribbons of pale gray light outlined drapes that were drawn across a very large window, or perhaps a pair of balcony doors. The Salco Southern Colonial had lots of balconies. In addition, around the corner from the doorway, out of sight, were 2 sources of eerie, soft green light that did little to dispel the gloom. Parker eased forward, clicked the light switch, entered the room, saw the Salco twins, and thought for an instant they were dead. They were lying on their backs in a queen-size bed, covers drawn up to their shoulders, unmoving, eyes open. Then Parker realized that the beeping and the green light came from the EEG and EKG monitors to which both girls were connected, and he saw the IV racks trailing lines to spikes inserted in their arms, so he knew they were not dead but merely in the process of being brainwashed. The chamber had none of the quality of a teenage girl's room, from the lack of personal mementos or any stamp of individuality. He assumed it was a guest room and that the girls had been put here in a single bed simply to make it easier to monitor them. But where were their captors and tormentors? Were the mind control experts so certain of the effectiveness of their drugs and other devices that they could leave the family alone and dash out for a Big Mac and fries at McDonald's? Was there no risk at all that one of the Salcos, in a moment of lucidity, might tear out his IV line, rise up and flee? Parker went to the nearest girl and looked into her blank eyes. For a few seconds she peered up, unblinking, then suddenly blinked furiously 10, 20, 30 times, then stared, unblinking again. She did not see Parker. He waved a hand across her eyes and got no reaction. He saw that she was wearing a pair of earphones connected to a tape recorder that lay on the pillow beside her head. He leaned close to her, lifted one earphone an inch, and listened to a soft, melodic, and very soothing voice, a woman's voice. On Monday morning, I slept in late. It's a wonderful hotel for sleeping late because the staff is so quiet, so respectful. It's actually a country club as well as a hotel, so it's not like other places where maids make a racket in the halls as soon as the sun rises. Oh, don't you just love the wine country? I'd like to live there someday. Anyway, after we finally got up, Chrissy and I took a long walk around the grounds, sort of hoping we'd run into some neat boys, but we couldn't find any. The hypnotic rhythms of the woman's voice spooked Parker. He put the earphones back in place. Evidently, one or more of the Salkos had remembered what they'd experienced at the Tranquility Motel the summer before last, so those memories had again been repressed. Now, to cover the time span of this current brainwashing session, new false memories were being implanted, a process that included the repeated playing of a tape recording that undoubtedly had subliminal as well as audible messages to impart. Dom had explained some of it to Parker on the telephone Saturday and Sunday nights, but Parker had not fully appreciated the hideousness of the conspiracy until he heard that insidious whisper in the Salko girl's ear. He moved to the foot of the bed and studied the other twin, whose eyes also alternated between blinkless stares and abrupt machine gun bursts of blinks. He wondered if he would do any physical or mental harm to them if he pulled out their IV lines, disconnected them from the machines, and moved them out of the house before their captors returned. Better to find a phone, call the police. How long they were watching him he did not know, but suddenly he was aware that he and the twins were not alone. He jumped and whirled toward the door where two men had entered the room. They were wearing dark slacks, white shirts with the sleeves rolled up and the collars unbuttoned, neckties loosened and askew. At the doorway behind them was another man, bespectacled and in a suit with his tie in place. They had to be government agents, for no one else would bother to wear business clothes while engaged upon activities of such a dubious nature. One of them said, "And who the fuck are you?" Parker did not attempt to drive them, did not foolishly claim his rights as a U.S. citizen, did not bother to say anything at all. He just took 3 running steps toward the drawn drapes, praying that a big window or sliding glass balcony door lay behind them, that it would shatter on impact, that the drapes would protect him from serious cuts, and that he would be outside and gone before they knew what happened. If the drapes were a lot wider than the window, covering more blank wall than glass, he was in big trouble. Behind them, the men shouted in surprise just as he hit the drapes, for they had obviously believed they trapped him. He went through the material with the unstoppable power of a locomotive. The impact was tremendous, sending a devastating shock across his shoulder and through his chest, but something gave way with a crack and a screech and a crash of glass, and he was through into daylight, vaguely aware that the doors had been French rather than sliding panels, and that he had been lucky the lock was flimsy. He found himself on a second-floor balcony with a pair of redwood lounge chairs and a glass-top table over which he fell. Even as he was going down on top of chairs, banging knees and barking shins, he was already coming up again, up and over the balcony rail, leaping out into space, praying he would not land in a particularly woody shrub and be castrated by a sharp, sturdy branch. He fell only 12 feet onto bare lawn, jarring his other shoulder and his back, but breaking no bones. He rolled, scrambled to his feet, and ran. Suddenly, in front of his eyes, foliage snapped, fluttered, shredded, and he didn't know what was happening. And then, as he continued to run, pieces of bark exploded off a tree, and he realized they were shooting at him. He heard no gunfire. Silencer equipped weapons. He zigzagged toward the perimeter of the property, fell in an azalea bed, scrambled up, ran on, reached a hedge, threw himself over it, and kept on running. They had been ready to kill him to stop him from spreading the news of what he had seen in the Salko house. Right now, they were probably hastily moving or killing the Salkos. if he found a phone and called the police, and if the killers were agents of the U.S. government, whose side would the police be on, and who would they believe? One eccentric and rather curiously dressed artist with a woolly beard and flyaway hair, or 3 neatly attired FBI men claiming they were in the Salco house on a legitimate stakeout of some kind, and that Parker Fane was in fact the felon they had attempted to arrest. If they demanded custody of him, would the police cooperate? Jesus. He ran. Abandoning the tempo, he sprinted down the slope wall of a shallow glen, along the rocky course of a narrow brook, between trees, through underbrush, up another wall of the same glen, into someone's backyard, across that lawn and into another yard, alongside a house, out into a street, from that street to another. He slowed to a fast walk to avoid drawing attention to himself, but he continued to follow a twisty route away from the Salco house. He knew what he had to do. The horror he had just seen had made the extremity of Dom's plight clearer than ever. Parker had known his friend was in danger, deep in a conspiracy of monumental proportions, but knowing it in his mind was not the same as knowing it in his guts. There was nothing for him to do but go to Elko County. Dom Corvasis was his friend, perhaps his best friend, and this is what friends did for each other, shared their trouble, fought back the darkness together. He could walk away, go back to Laguna Beach to continue work on the painting that he had begun yesterday, but if he chose that course, he would never like himself very much again, which would be an intolerable circumstance, for he had always liked himself immensely. He had to find a ride back to the Monterey airport, catch a flight to San Francisco International, and head east from there toward Nevada. He was not concerned that the men in the Salco's house would be looking for him at the airport. The only words any of them had spoken in his presence were, "And who the fuck are you?" If they did not know who he was, they would most likely figure he was a local. The keys to the Tempo had a rental company tag on them, but they were in his pocket. In an hour or two, of course, the bad guys would trace the car to the airport, but by then he should have taken off for San Francisco. He kept walking. On a quiet residential street, he saw a young man, about 19 or 20, in the driveway of a more modest house than the Salco's, carefully scrubbing the white walls and the tires of a meticulously restored banana yellow 1958 Plymouth Fury, one of those lawn jobs with a plentitude of grill and big sharky fins. The kid had a slick-back ducktail haircut to match the era of his vehicle. Parker went up to him and said, "Listen, my car broke down. I've got to get to the airport. I'm in a big hurry. So would you drive me out there for $50? The kid knew how to hurry. If he had not been a superb driver, he would have fishtailed out of control and spun them off the road into trees or ditches on a half-dozen tight turns, for he got all possible speed out of the big Fury. After they came through the third sharp turn alive, Parker knew he was in good hands, and he finally relaxed a bit. At the airport, he bought a ticket for one of 2 remaining seats on a West Air flight leaving for San Francisco in 10 minutes. He boarded the plane, half expecting it to be halted by federal agents before it could take off. But soon they were airborne, and he could worry about something else, getting another flight from San Francisco to Reno before they tracked him that far. Jack Twist went through the block's apartment from north to west to south to east facing windows, surveying the vast landscape for signs of the enemy's observation post or posts. At least one surveillance team would be watching the motel and diner, and no matter how well concealed they were, he had a device that would pinpoint their location. He had bought it from New York with the other gear, an instrument the armed forces called the HS-101 heat analyzer. It was shaped like a sleek futuristic ray gun from the movies, with a single 2-inch diameter lens instead of a barrel. You held it by the butt and looked through the eyepiece as if peering into a telescope. Moving the viewfinder across the landscape, you saw 2 things. an ordinary magnified image of the terrain, and an overlaid representation of heat sources within that terrain. Plants, animals, and sun-baked rocks radiated heat, but thanks to microchip technology, the HS-101's computer could differentiate among types of thermal radiation and screen out most natural background sources. The device would show only heat from living sources larger than 50 pounds, animals bigger than house dogs and human beings, even if they were out there in insulated ski suits that trapped a lot of body heat. Enough would escape their garments to give him a fix on them. Jack spent a considerable length of time studying the land north of the motel through which he had approached the place last night, but finally he decided no one was watching from that direction, and he moved to the west-facing windows in the other rooms. The west also looked clear, so he went next to the windows on the south side of the apartment. Marcy had colored The Last Moon in her album, and when Jack set out with the HS-101 to look for surveillance teams, she came with him, staying close by his side. Maybe she had taken a liking to him because he'd spent hours talking to her, in spite of her failure to respond. Or maybe she was scared of something and felt safer in his presence. Or another reason too strange to imagine. He could do nothing for her except keep talking softly to her as she accompanied him. Georgia followed along as well, and though she did not interrupt with questions, she was considerably more distracting than her daughter. She was a strikingly beautiful woman, but more importantly, he liked her a lot. He thought she liked him too, although he didn't suppose she was attracted to him, not in the man-woman sense. After all, what would a woman like her see in a guy like him? He was an admitted criminal, and he had a face like an old battered shoe, not to mention one cast eye. But they could be friends at least, and that was nice. At the living room windows, he finally spotted what he was seeking. Points of body heat out there in the cold barrens. Across the top of the image that filled the lens, Nevada plains and overlaid heat patterns, came a digital readout of data that told him there were two sources of heat, that they were due south of his position, and that they were approximately 0.4 of a mile away. That information was followed by numerals that represented an estimation of the size of each source's radiant surface, which told him he had found two men. He switched off the HS-101's heat analysis function and turned up the magnification, using the device's simple telescope, zeroing in on the area in which the heat had been detected. He had to search for a couple minutes, for they were wearing camouflage suits. "Bingo," he said at last. Georgia did not ask what he saw, for she had learned well the lesson he had taught them last night. Everything spoken in the apartment was sucked directly into the enemy's electronic ears. Out there on the barrens, the two observers were prone on the cold ground. Jack saw that one man had a pair of binoculars, but the guy was not using the glasses at the moment, so he was not aware of Jack watching him from the window. He moved to the east windows and surveyed that landscape at well, but it was uninhabited. They were being watched only from the south, which the enemy figured was sufficient, because the front of the motel and the only road leading to it could be seen from that single post. They were underestimating Jack. They knew his background, knew he was good, but they didn't realize how good. At 1:40, the first snowflakes fell. For a while, they came down only as scattered flurries of no particular force. At 2 o'clock, when Dom and Ernie returned from their scouting trip around the perimeter of the Thunder Hill Depository, Jack said, "You know, Ernie, when the storm really hits later, there might be some people on the interstate who will see our wheels out front and pull in here looking for shelter. Even if we leave the sign and other lights off. Better move my Cherokee, the Sarver's truck, and the cars around back. We don't want a lot of people rapping at your door wanting to know why you're giving rooms to some people and not to them." Actually certain that the enemy was even now listening to them, Jack was using the specter of weary, snowbound motorists as a plausible excuse to move the pickup truck and the Cherokee, the two four-wheel drive vehicles, out of sight of the observers south of I-80. Later, when heavier snow and the early darkness of the storm settled in, the entire Tranquility family would surreptitiously leave the motel from the rear, heading overland in the truck and the Cherokee. Ernie sensed Jack's real purpose, equally aware of eavesdroppers. He played along. He and Dom went outside again to move all the vehicles around back. In the kitchen, Ned and Sandy had nearly finished preparing and packaging the sandwiches that everyone would be issued for dinner. Now they had only to wait for Faye and Ginger. The snow flurries intermittently surrendered to furious but short-lived squalls. The day dimmed. By 2:40, the squalls turned to steady snow that, in spite of a complete cessation of wind, reduced visibility to a few hundred feet. Out on the barrens, the camouflaged observers were probably picking up their gear and moving closer to the motel. Jack checked his watch more frequently. He knew time was running out, but he had no way of knowing how fast it might be running out. While Lieutenant Horner repaired the sabotage polygraph in the security office, Falkirk lectured the depository's chief of security and his assistant, Major Fugata, and Lieutenant Helms, letting them know they were on his list of possible traitors. He made 2 enemies, but that didn't matter. He did not want them to like him, only to respect and fear him. He had not yet finished chewing out Fugata and Helms when General Alvarado arrived. The general was a lard-ass with a pot gut, fingers like sausages and jowls. He stormed into the security office in a red-faced outrage, having just heard the bad news from Dr. Miles Bennell. "Is it true, Colonel Falkirk? By God, is it true? Have you actually taken control of Vigilant and made prisoners of us all?" Sternly, but in a tone that could not be construed as disrespectful, Leland informed Alvarado that he had the authority to include the secret program in the security computer and to activate it at his discretion. Alvarado demanded to know whose authority, and Leland said General Maxwell D. Ridenour, Chief of Staff of the Army and Chairman of the Joint Chiefs. Alvarado said he knew perfectly well who Ridenour was, but he did not believe that the colonel's mentor in this matter was the Chief of Staff himself. "Sir, why don't you call him and ask?" Leland suggested. He took a card out of his wallet and gave it to Alvarado. "That's General Ridenour's number." "I have the Staff HQ number," Alvarado said scornfully. "Sir, that's not Staff HQ. That's General Ridenour's unlisted home line. If he's not in his office, he'd want you to contact him on the unlisted phone. After all, this is a deadly serious matter, sir." Burning a brighter red, Alvarado stalked out, the card pinched between thumb and forefinger, and held away from his side as if it were an offensive object. He was back in 15 minutes, no longer flushed but pale. "All right, Colonel, you have the authority you claim, so I guess you're in command of Thunder Hill for the time being." "Not at all, sir," Leland said. "You're still the CO." "But if I'm a prisoner," Leland interrupted. "Sir, your orders take precedence as long as they don't directly conflict with my authority to guarantee that no dangerous persons, no dangerous creatures escape from Thunder Hill." Alvarado shook his head in amazement. "According to Miles Bennell, you have this crazy idea that we're all some kind of monsters." The general had used the most melodramatic word he could think of with the intent of belittling Leland's position. "Sir, as you know, one or more people in this facility attempted by indirection to bring some of the witnesses back to the Tranquility, evidently with the hope that the witnesses will remember what they've been made to forget and will create a media circus that'll force us to reveal what we've hidden. Now, these traitors are probably just well-intentioned men, most likely members of Ben-El's staff, who simply believe the public should be informed, but the possibility also exists that they've got other and darker motives. Monsters, Alvarado repeated sourly. When the polygraph was repaired, Leland charged Major Fugata and Lieutenant Helms with interrogating everyone in Thunderhill who had knowledge of the special secret harbored there for more than 18 months. If you screw up again, Leland warned them, I'll have your heads. If they failed again to find the man who'd sent the Polaroids to the witnesses, he would view their failure as one more bit of evidence that rot had spread widely through the Thunderhill staff, and it was not ordinary human corruption, but the result of an extraordinary and terrifying infection. Their failure would cost them their lives. At 1:45, Leland and Lieutenant Horner returned to Schenkfield, leaving the depository's entire staff locked deep in the bosom of the earth. Upon his return to his windowless office in that other underground facility, the colonel received several doses of bad news, all courtesy of Foster Polnicheff, the head of the Chicago office of the FBI. First, Sharko was dead out in Evanston, Illinois, which should have been good news, but he had taken his sister, brother-in-law, and an entire SWAT team with him. The siege of Sharko's house had become national news due to the extreme violence of its conclusion. The blood-hungry media would be focused on O'Bannon Lane until endless rehashing of the story drained it of thrills. Worse, among Sharko's mad ravings, there had been enough truth to lead a perceptive and aggressive reporter to Nevada, to the Tranquility, and perhaps all the way to Thunderhill. Worst of all, Foster Polnicheff reported that something almost, supernatural is happening here. A stabbing and shooting in an uptown apartment involving a family named Mendoza had caused such a sensation within the city's police department that newspaper reporters and television crews had virtually set siege to the tenement house hours ago. Evidently, Winton Toke, the officer whose life had been saved by Brendan Cronin, had brought a stabbed child back from near death. Incredibly, Brendan Cronin had passed his own amazing talents to Toke, but what else had he passed on to the black policeman? There might be only a wondrous new power in Winton Toke, or something dark and dangerous, alive and inhuman, living within the cop. The worst possible scenario was, after all, unfolding. Leland was half sick with apprehension as he listened to Polnicheff. According to the FBI agent, Toke was giving no interviews to the press and was, in fact, now in seclusion in his own house, where another mob of reporters had gathered. Sooner or later, however, Toke would agree to speak with the press, and he would mention Brendan Cronin, and from there they would eventually find the link to the Halborg girl. The Halborg girl, that was another nightmare. Upon receiving this morning's news of Toke's unexpected healing powers, Polnicheff had gone to the Halborg's home to determine if Emmy had acquired unusual powers subsequent to her own miraculous recovery. What he found there beggared description, and he immediately isolated the entire Halborg family from the press and public before their secret was discovered. Now, all 5 Halborgs were in an FBI safe house under the watchful eyes of 6 agents who'd been informed only that the family was as much to be feared as protected, and that no agent was to be alone with any member of the family at any time. If the Halborgs made threatening or unusual moves, they would all be killed instantly. But I think it's all pointless now, Polnicheff said on the phone from Chicago. I think we've lost control of it. It's spread, and we've no hope of containing it again. So we might as well call an end to the cover-up, go public. Are you mad? Leland demanded. If it's come to the point where we have to kill people, lots of people, like the Halborgs and the Tolks and all the witnesses there in Nevada, in order just to keep the story contained, then the cost of containment has gotten too damn high. Leland Falkirk was furious. You've lost sight of what's at stake here. My God, man. We're no longer merely trying to keep the news from the public. That's almost immaterial now. Now we're trying to protect our entire species from obliteration. If we go public, and if then we decide to use violence to contain the infection, every goddamn politician and bleeding heart will be second-guessing us, interfering, and before you know it, we'll have lost the war. But I think what's being proven here is that the danger isn't that great, Polnichev said. Sure, I've told the men guarding the Halborgs to regard them as a threat, but I don't really believe they're a danger to us. That little Emmy, she's a darling, not a monster. I don't know how the power got in Cronin or how he conveyed it to the girl, but I'm almost willing to bet my life that the power is the only thing inside the child, the only thing inside any of them. If you could meet Emmy and watch her, Colonel, she's a delight. All evidence points to the fact that we should regard what's happening here as the greatest event in the history of mankind. Of course, Leland said coldly. That's what an enemy like this would want us to believe. If we can be convinced that accommodation and surrender are a great blessing, we'll be conquered without a fight. But Colonel, if Cronin and Corvasis and Tolk and Emmy have been infected, if they're no longer human, or at least no longer like you and me, they wouldn't advertise by performing miraculous cures and feats of telekinesis. They'd keep their amazing abilities secret in order to spread their infection to more people without detection. Leland was unmoved by that argument. We don't know exactly how this thing works. Maybe a person once infected surrenders control to the parasite, becomes a slave. Or to answer the point you've just made, maybe the relationship between the host and parasite is benign, mutually supportive, and maybe the host doesn't even know the parasite is inside him, which would explain why the Halborg girl and the others don't know where their power comes from. But in either case, that person is no longer strictly human, and in my estimation, Polnichev, that person can no longer be trusted, not an inch. Now, for God's sake, you've got to take the entire Tolk family into custody too. Isolate them at once. As I told you, Colonel, journalists surround the Tolk house. If I go in there with agents and take the Tolks into custody in front of a score of reporters, our cover-up is blown. And although I no longer believe in the cover-up, I'm not going to sabotage it. I know my duty. You've at least got agents watching the house? Yes. What about the Mendozas? If Tolk infected the boy the way Cronin apparently infected him, we're watching the Mendozas, Polnichev said. Again, we can't make a bold move because of the reporters. The other problem was Father Stefan Wykazik. The priest had been to the Mendoza's apartment and then to the Halborg house before Foster Polnichev had known what was going on at either location. Later, an FBI agent had seen Wykazik at barricades near the Sharko house in Evanston at the very moment when Sharko had detonated his bomb, but no one knew where he had gone. No one had seen him in almost 6 hours. Obviously, he's putting it together piece by piece. One more reason to call off the cover-up and go public before we're all caught in the act anyway. Leland Falkirk suddenly felt that everything was flying apart, out of control, and he had trouble breathing, for he had dedicated his life to the philosophy and principles of control, unremitting iron control in all things. Control was what mattered more than anything else. First came self-control. You had to learn to exert unfaltering control over your desires and ignoble impulses, or otherwise you risked destruction by one vice or another, alcohol, drugs, sex. He learned that much from his ultra-religious parents, who had begun drumming the lesson into him before he was even old enough to understand what they were saying. And you also had to control your intellectual processes. You had to force yourself to rely always on logic and reason, for it was human nature to drift into superstition, into patterns of behavior based on irrational assumptions. That was a lesson he had learned in spite of his parents, from attending Pentecostal services with them and watching in shock and fear as they fell to the floor of the church or revival tent, where they screamed and thrashed in wild abandon, transported by what they claimed was the Spirit of God, though it was actually just hysterical holy rollerism. You had to control your fear too, or you could not hold on to your sanity for long. He had taught himself to conquer his fear of his parents, who had routinely beat and punished him while claiming it was for his own good because the devil was in him and must be driven out. One way of learning to control fear was by subjecting yourself to pain and thereby increasing your tolerance for it, because you couldn't be afraid of anything if you were sure you could bear the pain it might cause you. Control. Leland Falkirk controlled himself, his life, his men, and any assignment that he was given. But now he felt control of this situation slipping quickly out of his grasp, and he was closer to panic than he had been in more than 40 years. "Polnichev," he said, "I'm going to hang up, but you stand by your phone. My man will set up a scramble conference call between me, you, your director, Ridenour in Washington, and our White House contact. We're going to agree on a tough policy and the best way of implementing it. Damned if I'll let you gutless wonders fall apart on this. We'll keep control. We're going to eradicate the infected people if that's necessary, even if some of them are cute little girls and priests. And we are going to save our asses. By God, I'm going to make sure we do." When Faye and Ginger returned from Elko at 2:45 in the motel van, the green-brown car followed them down the exit ramp from I-80. Ginger was half convinced it would swing into the motel lot and park beside them, but it stopped along the county road 100 feet short of the Tranquility and waited in the slanting snowfall. Faye parked in front of the motel office door, and Dom and Ernie came out to help them unload the purchases they had made in Elko: ski suits, ski masks, boots, and insulated gloves for those who didn't already have them, based on sizes everyone had provided last night. 2 new semi-automatic 20-gauge shotguns, ammunition for those weapons and the others, backpacks, flashlights, 2 compasses, a small acetylene torch with 2 bottles of gas, and a number of other items. Ernie embraced Faye and Dom embraced Ginger. Simultaneously, both men said, "I was worried about you," and Ginger heard herself saying, "I was worried about you too." Even as Faye said it, Ernie and Faye kissed. With snowflakes frosting his eyebrows and melting into jeweled beads of water on his lashes, Dom lowered his face to Ginger's, and they kissed too, a sweet, warm, lingering kiss. Somehow it was as right for her and Dom to greet each other in such a fashion as it was for Faye and Ernie, husband and wife. That rightness was part of everything Ginger had felt for him since returning in Elko 2 days ago. When everything had been unloaded from the van and stashed in the Blocks apartment, all 10 members of the Tranquility family adjourned to the diner. Jack, Ernie, Dom, Ned, and Faye brought guns. As she pulled some chairs up to the table where Brendan and Dom had tested their powers last night, Ginger noticed that the priest regarded the weapons with a mixture of displeasure and fear, that he seemed far less optimistic than yesterday, when his discovery of his amazing gift had sent his spirits soaring. "No dream last night," he explained when she asked the reason for his grim mood. "No golden light, no voice calling to me. You know, Ginger, I told myself all along that I didn't believe I was being called here by God. But deep down, that is what I believed. Father Wykazik was right. There was always a core of faith in me. Recently, I've been edging back to an acceptance of God. Not only acceptance, I need Him again. But now, no dream, no golden light, as if God's abandoned me. No, you're wrong, Ginger said, taking his hand as if she could absorb his distress by osmosis and leave him feeling better. If you believe in God, He never abandons you, right? You can abandon God, but never the other way around. He always forgives, always loves. Isn't that what you tell a parishioner? Brendan smiled wanly. Sounds like you went to seminary. She said the dream was probably just a memory surging against the block that's holding it down in your subconscious. But if it was really God summoning you here, well, the reason you no longer have the dream is because you've arrived. You've come as He wanted, so there's no need for Him to send you the dream anymore. See? The priest's face brightened a little. They took up seats around the table. With dismay, Ginger saw that Marcy's condition had worsened since last night. The girl sat with her head bent, face half hidden by her thick black hair, staring at her tiny hands, which lay limply in her lap. She mumbled, "Moon, moon, the moon, moon." She was in awe-out pursuit of those memories of July 6, which remained teasingly on the edge of her awareness, and which, by their tantalizing inaccessibility, had drawn her into obsessive contemplation of their half-glimpsed forms. "She'll come out of it," Ginger told Georgia, knowing how empty and foolish a statement was, yet unable to think of anything else to say. "Yes," Georgia said, apparently not finding it empty or foolish, but reassuring. "She has to come out of it. She has to." Jack and Ned stood the plywood panel against the door and braced it with the table again, assuring freedom from eavesdroppers. Quickly, Faye and Ginger told of their visit to the Jamisons' ranch and of being followed by the two men in the Plymouth. Ernie and Dom had been followed too. This news made Jack edgy. If they're coming out in the open to keep tabs on us, that means they're almost ready to grab us again. Ned Sarver said, "Maybe I'd just better stand watch, make sure nobody's moving in on us already." Jack agreed, and Ned went to the door and put one eye against the narrow crack between the plywood and the door frame, looking out at the snow-swept parking lot. At Jack's request, Dom and Ernie explained what they had found on their tour of the Thunderhill Depository's perimeter fence. Jack listened carefully, asking a number of questions for which Ginger could not always discern the purpose. Were any thin, bare wires woven through the chain-link fence? What were the fence posts like? Finally, he asked, no guard dogs or men on patrol? Dom said no. There'd have been prints in the snow along the fence. Must be heavy electronic security. I had hoped we'd be able to get in the grounds, but not after I got a close-up view of the place. "Oh, we'll get on the grounds all right," Jack said. "The tricky part will be getting inside the depository itself." Dom and Ernie looked at him with such astonishment that Ginger knew Thunderhill must have looked formidable indeed. "Get inside," Dom said. "No can do," Ernie said. "If they rely on multiple electronic systems for their perimeter security," Jack said, "they'll very likely also rely on electronics at the main entrance. That's the way it is these days. Everyone's dazzled by high tech." "Oh, sure, Thunderhill will have a guard at the front gate, but he'll be so used to depending on computers, video cameras, and other gadgets that he'll be lax. So we might be able to surprise him, get by him. Once inside, though, I don't know how far we can go or what we might be able to get a peek at before we're nailed." Ginger said, "But how can you be so sure?" "For 8 years," Jack reminded her. "Getting into and back out of difficult places was my line of work. And it was the government that originally trained me, so I know their routines and tricks." He winked his misaligned eye. I have some tricks of my own. Georgia spoke up, obviously more than a little distressed. But you've as much said you'll be caught in there. Oh, yes, Jack said. But then what's the point of going in? Georgia asked. He had it all planned out, and Ginger listened at first in utter bafflement, and then with growing admiration for his sense of strategy. Jack laid out the details of his plan as if it were a foregone conclusion that the other 9 members of the group would agree to do precisely what he told them, regardless of the risks involved. He employed every trick of coercion and leadership that he knew, not because he was unwilling to consider alternatives to his strategy or modifications of it, but because there simply was no time to explore other courses of action. His intellect and his instinct had the same message for him: time is running out. So he explained to the rest of the Tranquility family that within the next hour, everyone except Dom, Ned, and Jack himself would pile in the Cherokee, leave overland from the rear of the motel, and drive into Elko by a roundabout route, thereby slipping the waiting tails. In Elko, the group would split up. Ernie, Faye, and Ginger would drive the Cherokee north to Twin Falls, Idaho, then to Pocatello. From there, they would arrange to fly to Boston, where they would stay with Ginger's friends, the Hannabys. They should get to Boston late Thursday or early Friday. Immediately upon their arrival, they would tell the Hannabys every detail of what they had discovered. Then, within an hour or two, Ginger would call together as many of her colleagues at Boston Memorial as possible, and she and the box would tell those physicians what had been done to a lot of innocent people in Nevada 2 summers ago. Meanwhile, George and Rita Hannaby would contact influential friends and arrange meetings at which Ginger and the box could spread their tale. Only then would Ginger, Faye, and Ernie go to the press. And only after they had gone to the press would they go to the police with a statement contesting the heretofore accepted wisdom that Pablo Jackson had been murdered by an ordinary burglar 8 days ago. The trick, Jack said, is to get your story into wide circulation among some important people, so if you have an accident before you've convinced the press to take up your cause, there will be a whole lot of powerful folks demanding to know who killed you and why. That's the special value you have for us now, Ginger. Your associations with a spectrum of important people in one of the country's most influential cities. If you can electrify those people with your story, you'll be creating an imposing group of advocates. Just remember, when you get back there, you're going to have to move fast before the conspirators discover you've gone home and decide to grab you or blow you away. Outside, the wind suddenly rose, keening at the plywood-covered windows. Good. If the storm worsened, cutting visibility farther, they would have a better chance of slipping away from the motel unobserved. After Ginger, Faye, and Ernie leave Elko in the Cherokee, heading up toward Pocatello, Jack said, using a tone of voice that implied these steps were not suggestions but immutable necessities. You other 4, Brandon, Sandy, Georgia, and Marcy, will go to the local Jeep dealership and buy another 4-wheel drive vehicle with cash that I'll give you before you leave the Tranquility. Immediately after signing the papers, you'll head out of Elko in a different direction from Ginger and the box, east towards Salt Lake City, Utah. The snow will slow you down, of course, but you should be able to reach Salt Lake, get a flight out as soon as the storm subsides, and be in Chicago by Thursday afternoon or evening. He turned to the priest. Brandon, when you touch down at O'Hare, you'll contact your rector, this Father Wykazik you've told us about. He must use his pull to arrange an immediate emergency meeting with whoever's head of the Chicago Archdiocese. Richard Cardinal O'Callaghan, Brendan said, but I don't know if even Father Wykazik could arrange an immediate meeting with him. He has to, Jack said firmly. Brendan, you've got to move fast, just as Ginger will be moving fast in Boston. We've got to assume our enemies will be quick about spotting you when you turn up in Chicago. Anyway, at the meeting with Cardinal O'Callaghan, you and Georgia and Sandy will explain what's happened in Elko County. And Brendan, you'll give a demonstration of your newly discovered telekinetic ability. Pull out all the stops, okay? Do cardinals wear pants under their robes? Brendan blinked in surprise. What? Of course they wear pants. Then I want you to scare the pants off your Cardinal O'Callaghan. Give him a show that'll let him know he's part of the biggest story since they found the stone rolled away from the mouth of that tomb 2,000 years ago. And I don't mean to be blasphemous, Brendan. I really think it is the biggest story since. So do I, Brendan said. Though he had been glum all morning, he seemed to take heart from Jack's tone of authority and quiet excitement. Now, the wild wind was vibrating the sheets of plywood at the windows, filling the restaurant with a low and ominous thrumming. Ernie Block cocked his gray-bristled head, listening, and said, with winds like this already, so soon after the snow hits, it's going to be a roof raiser later on. Jack didn't want the weather to deteriorate too rapidly, for if the enemy was going to strike within the next few hours as he anticipated, they might accelerate their schedule to avoid the messy complications of conducting the roundup in a full-scale blizzard. Okay, Brendan, Jack said, convince Cardinal O'Callaghan and get him to arrange quick meetings with the mayor, city councilmen, social and financial leaders. You might have as much as 24 hours to spread your story before your life is in danger. The farther you spread it, the less danger you're in. But in any case, you shouldn't risk spending more than 12 hours putting together a network of powerful advocates before you ask them to arrange a press conference. Just picture it, the city's most prominent citizens forming a backdrop for you, reporters wondering what the hell is about to happen, and then you display your telekinetic ability by levitating a chair and sending it on a nice slow trip around the room. Brendan grinned broadly. That'll put an end to their cover-up for sure. No way they can continue it after that. Let's hope so, Jack said, because while the rest of you are off on your various missions, Dom and Ned and I will be inside Thunderhill, perhaps under military arrest, and our only chance of getting out in the same condition we went in is if you blow this wide open. Georgia said, I don't like that part of it, the three of you going into the mountain. Why is it necessary? I asked you that same question 15 minutes ago, and you still haven't answered me, Jack. If we can slip out of here, back to Boston and Chicago, use Ginger and Brendan's connections to blast the story wide open, and there's no need to go poking around in the depository. Once we've set the wheels of the press in motion, the Army and whatever government agencies are involved will eventually have to come clean. They'll have to tell us what happened that summer and what they've been doing in Thunderhill. Jack took a deep breath, for this was the part at which they might balk, especially Ned and Dom. Sorry, Georgia, but that's naive. If we all split and tell our stories, there will be enormous pressure on the military and government to reveal the truth, yes, but they'll delay. They'll drag their feet and spread contradictory stories for weeks, months. That'll give them time to devise a convincing lie to explain everything, yet reveal nothing. Our only hope of exposing the truth is to make them open up fast. And to speed things along, the rest of you have to be able to tell the world that three of your friends, Dom, Ned, and me, are being held against our will inside the mountain, hostages. The element of a hostage drama, with agencies of our own government in the role of terrorists, will be the final ingredient that might make it impossible for the Army to stonewall more than a day or two. He could see that this revelation startled everyone. Ernie and Faye regarded him with a mixture of shock and sadness, as if he were already dead or mind-wiped. Fear had risen like a dark moon in Georgia's face. She said, "But you can't. No. You simply can't sacrifice yourselves." "If the rest of you do your jobs properly," Jack said quickly, "we won't be sacrificing ourselves. You'll pry us out of Thunderhill with the lever of public protest that you create. That's why it's so important we all do exactly what we're supposed to." "But," Georgia said, "what if by some chance you get inside the mountain and manage to see something that explains what happened to us that July? And what if you could snap a few pictures of it and get back out alive? Surely in that case, you'd try to escape. You're not saying that the hostage drama has to be part of it, are you?" Jack said, "No, of course not." He was lying. Though there was at least a small chance of getting deep into the depository, Jack knew there was little hope of getting all the way back out again undetected. As for finding something in there that would immediately explain what they had seen the summer before last, there was no hope whatsoever. For one thing, they had no idea what they were looking for. It was possible, even probable, that they would pass right by the thing they were after without knowing what they had seen. Furthermore, if dangerous experiments had been taking place in Thunderhill, and if one of those experiments had gotten out of hand that July night, the answer to the mystery was likely to lie in paper or microfilm files, or in lab reports. Even if they could gain access to the labs, he and Dom and Ned would not have time to pore leisurely through tons of paperwork, looking for the few pertinent ounces that would shed light upon their experience. He did not say any of this to Georgia or the others. He could not permit the meeting to degenerate into debate about potential risks and other options. Outside, the wind howled. Georgia said, "And if you absolutely insist on going in there, why couldn't the rest of us stay as near to you as possible? I mean, the 7 of us could just go into Elko, to the offices of the Sentinel, and Brendan could demonstrate his power to the local press. We could start exposing the conspiracy here instead of in Chicago and Boston." "No." Jack was moved but also frustrated by her concern for him. Parentheses, the hands on his wristwatch seemed to be spinning for God's sakes. Close parentheses. The national media wouldn't pay quick enough attention to a small-town newspaper's report that it had turned up a man with psychic powers and a major government conspiracy. It would be viewed as just another jerkwater story in the same league as reports of abominable snowmen and UFOs. Our enemies would find you and squash any local reporters you spoke with, long before the national media would bother sending anyone to check it out. You've got to go, Georgia. The way I've outlined it, that's our best hope.